Chapter 6 of True Stories of Crime from the District Attorney's Office by Arthur Cheney Train. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Chapter 6 A Study in Finance. He that maketh haste to be rich shall not be innocent. Proverbs 28, verse 20. The victim of moral overstrain is the central figure in many novels and countless magazine stories. In most of them he finally repents him fully of his sins past, and returns to his former or to some equally desirable position, to lead a new and better life. The dangers and temptations of the street are, however, too real and terrible to be studied other than in actuality, and the fall of hundreds of previously honest young men owing to easily remedied conditions should teach its lesson, not only to their comrades but to their employers as well. The ball and chain, quite as often as repentance and forgiveness, ends their experience. No young man takes a position in a banking house with the deliberate intention of becoming an embezzler. He knows precisely, as well as does the reader, that if he listens to the whisper of temptation he is lost, and so does his employer. Yet the employer, who would hold himself remiss if he allowed his little boy to have the run of the jam closet, and then discovered that the latter's lips bore evidence of petty larceny, or would regard himself as almost criminally negligent if he placed a priceless pearl necklace where an ignorant chimney sweep might fall under the hypnotism of its shimmer, will calmly allow a condition of things in his own brokerage or banking office, where a $15 a week clerk may have free access to $1 million worth of negotiable securities, and even encourage the latter by occasional sure tips to take a flyer in the market. It is a deplorable fact that the officers of certain companies occasionally unload undesirable securities upon their employees, and in order to boom or create a movement in a certain stock, will induce the persons under their control to purchase it. It would be a rare case in which a clerk who valued his situation would refuse to take a few shares in an enterprise which the head of the firm was fathering. Of course, such occurrences are the exceptions, but there are plenty of houses not far from Wall Street where the partners know that their clerks and messengers are playing the market, and exert not the slightest influence to stop them. When these men find that they and their customers, and not the clerks and messengers, are paying the loss accounts of the latter, they are very much distressed, and tell the district attorney, with regret, that only by sending such wicked and treacherous persons to state's prison can similar dishonesty be prevented. Not long ago the writer became acquainted with a young man who, as loan clerk in a trust company, had misappropriated a large amount of securities, and had pled guilty to the crime of grand larceny in the first degree. He was awaiting sentence, and in connection therewith it became necessary to examine into the conditions prevailing generally in the financial district. His story is already public property, for the case attracted wide attention in the daily press, but inasmuch as the writer's object is to point a moral rather than adorn a tale, the culprit's name and the name of the company with which he was connected need not be given. He is now serving a term in state's prison, and is, the writer believes, sincerely repentant, and determined to make a man of himself upon his release. For present purposes, let him be called John Smith. He was born in New York City, in surroundings rather better than the average. His family were persons of good education, and his home was a comfortable and happy one. From childhood he received thorough religious instruction, and was always a straightforward, honest, and obedient boy. His father, having concluded from observation that the shortest route to success lay in financial enterprise, secured a place in a broker's office for his son after the latter's graduation from the high school. John began at the bottom and gradually worked up to the position of assistant loan clerk in a big trust company. This took 15 years of hard work. From the day that he started in filling inkwells and cleaning out ticker baskets, he saw fortunes made and lost in a twinkling. He learned that the chief business of a broker is acting as go-between for persons who are trying to sell what they do not own to others who do not have the money to pay for what they buy. And he saw hundreds of such persons grow rich on these fictitious transactions. He also saw others wiped out, but they cheerfully went through bankruptcy and began again, many of them achieving wealth on their second or third attempt. He was earning $5 a week and getting his lunch at a vegetarian health restaurant for 15 cents. The broker, for whom he ran errands, gave away 35-cent cigars to his customers and had an elaborate luncheon served in the office daily to a dozen or more of the elect. John knew one boy of about his own age who, having made a successful turn, began as a trader and cleaned up $100,000 in a rising market the first year. That was better than the cleaning up John was used to, but he was a sensible boy and had made up his mind to succeed in a legitimate fashion. Gradually he saved a few $100s and, acting on the knowledge he had gained in his business, bought 2 or 3 shares in a security which quickly advanced in value and almost doubled his money. The next time as well fortune favored him, and he soon had a comfortable nest egg, enough to warrant his feeling reasonably secure in the event of accident or sickness. He had worked faithfully, had given great satisfaction to his employers, and presently had a clerical position in a prominent trust company offered to him. It seemed an advance. The salary was larger, even if absurdly small, and he gladly accepted the place. Shortly after this he had his first experience in real finance. The president of the company sent for him. The reader will remember that this is a true story, and the boy entered his private office and came into the august presence of the magnate. This man is today what is commonly known as a power in Wall Street. "My boy," said the president, "you have been doing very well. I have noticed the excellence of your work. I want to commend you." "Thank you, sir," said John modestly, expecting to hear that his salary was to be raised. "Yes," continued the great man, "and I want you to have an interest in the business." The blood rushed to John's head and face. "Thank you very much," he gasped. "I have allotted you 5 shares in the trust company," said the president. "If you take them up and carry them, you will feel that you have a real connection with the house, and it will net you a handsome return. Have you any money?" It so happened that at this time John's savings were invested in a few bonds of an old and conservatively managed railroad. His heart fell. He didn't want to buy any bank stock. "No," he answered. "My salary is small enough, and I need it all. I don't save any money." "Oh, well," said the magnate, "I will try and fix it up for you. I will arrange for a loan with the bank on the stock. Remember, I'm doing this to help you. That is all. You may go back to your books." Next day John was informed that he had bought 5 shares of Trust Company stock in the neighborhood of 300, and he signed a note for $1,425 and endorsed the stock over to the bank from which the money had been borrowed for him. The stock almost immediately dropped over 50 points. John paid the interest on the note out of his salary, and the dividends, as fast as they were declared, went to extinguish the body of the loan. Some time afterward he learned that he had bought the stock from the magnate himself. He never received any benefit from it, for the stock was sold to cover the note, and John was obliged to make up the difference. He also discovered that 10 or 15 other employees had been given a similar opportunity by their generous employer at about the same time. John, in prison, says it was a scheme to keep 50 or 100 shares where it could easily be controlled by the president without risk to himself, in case of need. Of course, he may be wrong. At any rate, he feels bitterly now toward the big men who are at large while he is in jail. John continued to keep up with the acquaintances formed during his years in the broker's office, many of whom had started little businesses of their own and had done well. Part of their stock in trade was to appear prosperous, and they took John out to lunch and told him what a fine fellow he was and gave him sure tips. But John had grown wise. He had had all the chances of that sort he wanted, and from a bigger man than any of them. He ate their lunches and invited them in return. Then he economized for a day or two to even up. He was not prosperous himself, but he did not accept favors without repaying them. One thing he observed and noted carefully. Every man he knew who had begun a brokerage business and kept sober, who attended to business and did not speculate, made money and plenty of it. He knew one young firm which cleared up $15,000 in commissions at the end of the second year. That looked good to him, and he knew besides that he was sober and attended to business. He made inquiries and learned that one could start in, if one were modest in one's pretensions, for $2,500. That would pay office rent and keep things going until the commissions began to come in. He started to look around for some other young man who could put up the money in consideration of John's contributing the experience. But all the men he knew had experience without money. Then, by chance, he met a young fellow of bright and agreeable personality, whom we shall call Prescott. The latter was 5 or 6 years older than John. had had a large experience in brokerage houses in another city, and had come to New York to promote the interests of a certain copper company. John had progressed and was now assistant loan clerk of one of the biggest trust companies in the city, which also happened to be the transfer agent for the copper company. Thus, John had constantly to handle its certificates. Prescott said it was a wonderful thing, that some of the keenest men in the street were in it, and, although it was a curb stock, strongly advised his new friend to buy all he could of it. He assured John that, although he was admittedly interested in booming the stock, he was confident that before long it would sell at 4 times its present quotation. Meantime the stock, which had been listed at 2 1/4, began to go rapidly up. Word went around the trust company that it was a great purchase anywhere below 10, and John, as well as the other boys employed in the company, got together what money he could and began to buy it. It continued to go up. They had unconsciously assisted in its ascent, and they bought more. John purchased 75 shares, all the way up to 8 and 9. One of his friends took 800. Then it dropped out of sight. They hadn't time to get out, and John in prison has his yet. But he still had faith in Prescott, for he liked him and believed in his business capacity. The stock operation over, Prescott began to prospect for something new, and suggested to John that they form a brokerage house under the latter's name. John was to be president at a fixed salary. It sounded very grand. His duties at the trust company began to seem picayune. Moreover, his loss in copper had depressed him, and he wanted to recoup if he could. But how to get the $2,500 necessary to start in business? Prescott pleaded poverty, yet talked constantly of the ease with which a fortune might be made if they could only once get in right. It was a period of increased dividends, of stock jobbing operations of enormous magnitude, of 50-point movements, when the lucky purchaser of only 100 shares of some inconspicuous railroad sometimes found that he could sell out next week with $5,000 profit. The air seemed full of money. It appeared to rain banknotes and stock certificates. In the loan cage at the trust company, John handled daily millions in securities, a great part of which were negotiable. When almost everybody was so rich, he wondered why anyone remained poor. 2 or 3 men of his own age gave up their jobs in other concerns and became traders, while another opened an office of his own. John was told that they had acted on good information, had bought a few hundred shares of Union Pacific, and were now comfortably fixed. He would have been glad to buy, but copper had left him without anything to buy with. One day Prescott took him out to lunch and confided to him that one of the big speculators had tipped him off to buy cotton, since there was going to be a failure in the crop. It was practically a sure thing. $2,000 margin would buy enough cotton to start them in business, even if the rise was only a very small one. "Why don't you borrow a couple of bonds?" asked Prescott. "Borrow from whom?" inquired John. "Why, from some customer of the trust company." "No one would lend them to me," answered John. "Well, borrow them anyhow. They would never know about it, and you could put them back as soon as we closed the account," suggested Prescott. John was shocked and said so. "You are easy," said his comrade. "Don't you know that the trust companies do it themselves all the time? The presidents of the railroads use the holdings of their companies as collateral. Even the banks use their deposits for trading. Didn't old Blank dump a lot of rotten stuff on you? Why don't you get even? Let me tell you something. Fully 1/2 of the men who are now successful financiers got their start by putting up as margin securities deposited with them. No one ever knew the difference, and now they are on their feet. If you took 2 bonds overnight, you might put them back in the morning. Everyone does it. It's part of the game." "But suppose we lost?" asked John. "You can't," said Prescott. "Cotton is sure to go up. It's throwing away the chance of your life." John said he couldn't do such a thing. But when he returned to the office, the cashier told him that a merger had been planned between their company and another, a larger one. John knew what that meant well enough. Half the clerks would lose their positions. He was getting $35 a week, had married a young wife, and, as he had told the magnate, he needed it all. That night, as he put the securities from the loan cage back in the vault, the bonds burned his fingers. They were lying around loose, no good to anybody, and only 2 of them, overnight maybe, would make him independent of salaries and mergers, a free man and his own master. The vault was in the basement, just below the loan cage. It was some 20 feet long and 10 wide. There were 3 tiers of boxes with double combination doors. In the extreme left-hand corner was the loan box. Near it were two other boxes in which the securities of certain customers on deposit were kept. John had individual access to the loan box and the two others, one of which contained the collateral which secured loans that were practically permanent. He thus had within his control negotiable bonds of over $1 million in value. The securities were in piles, strapped with rubber bands, and bore slips on which were written the names of the owners. Every morning John carried up all these piles to the loan cage, except the securities on deposit. At the end of the day he carried all back himself and tossed them into the boxes. When the interest coupons on the deposited bonds had to be cut, he carried these also upstairs. At night the vault was secured by two doors, one with a combination lock and the other with a time lock. It was as safe as human ingenuity could make it. By day it had only a steel wire gate which could be opened with a key. No attendant was stationed at the door. If John wanted to get in, all he had to do was ask the person who had the key to open it. The reason John had the combination to these different boxes was in order to save the loan clerk the trouble of going downstairs to get the collateral himself. Next day, when John went out to lunch, he put two bonds belonging to a customer in his pocket. He did not intend to steal them, or even to borrow them. It was done almost automatically. His will seemed subjugated to the idea that they were to all intents and purposes his bonds to do as he liked with. He wanted the feeling of bonds in his pocket. As he walked along the street to the restaurant, it seemed quite natural that they should be there. They were nearly as safe with him as lying around loose in the cage or chucked into a box in the vault. Prescott joined him, full of his new idea that cotton was going to jump overnight. "If you only had a couple of bonds," he sighed. Then, somehow, John's legs and arms grew weak. He seemed to disintegrate internally. He tried to pull himself together, but he had lost control of his muscles. He became a dual personality. His own John heard Prescott's John say quite naturally, "I can let you have two bonds, but mind we get them back tomorrow, or anyhow the day after." John's John felt the other John slip the two American Navigation 4s under the table, and Prescott's fingers close upon them. Then came a period of hypnotic paralysis. The flywheel of his willpower hung on a dead center. Almost instantly he became himself again. "Give 'em back," he whispered hoarsely. "I don't mean you should keep them," and he reached anxiously across the table. But Prescott was on his feet, halfway toward the door. "Don't be a fool, Smith," he laughed. "What's the matter with you? It's a cinch. Go back and forget it." He shot out of the door and down the street. John followed, dazed and trembling with horror at what he had done. He went back to the cage and remained the rest of the day in terror lest the broker who owned the two bonds should pay off his loan. But at the same time he had quickly made up his mind what he should do in that event. There was more than one loan secured by American Navigation 4s. He loosened a couple in one of the other piles. If the first broker came in, he would take two bonds from one of these. But the broker did not come in. That night John wandered the streets until nearly daylight. He saw himself arrested, ruined, in prison. Utterly fagged the next morning, he called up Prescott on the telephone and begged him to return the bonds. Prescott laughed at his fears and assured him that everything was all right. Cotton was sure to go up. An hour later, the broker who owned the bonds came in and took up his loan, and John removed two American Navigation 4s from another bundle and handed them to the loan clerk. Of course, the numbers on the bonds were not the same, but few persons would notice a little thing like that, even if they kept a record of it. They had the bonds, that was the main thing. Once more John rushed to the phone, told Prescott what had occurred, and besought him for the bonds. "It's too late now," growled Prescott. "Cotton has gone down. I could only get one back at the most. We'd better stand pat and get out on the next bulge." John was by this time almost hysterical. The perspiration broke out on his forehead every now and then, and he shuddered as he counted his securities and entered up his figures. If cotton should go down some more, that was the hideous possibility. They would have to put up more margins, and then... Down in the vault, where the depositors' bonds were kept, were two piles of Overland 4s. One contained about 200, and the other nearly 600 bonds. The par value of these negotiable securities alone was nearly $800,000. Twice a year, John cut the coupons off of them. Each pile was marked with the owner's name. They were never called for, and it appeared that these customers intended to keep them there permanently. John, realizing that the chances of detection were smaller, removed 2 bonds from the pile of 200 overlands and substituted them with Prescott for the 2 navigation 4s. Then cotton went down with a slump. Prescott did not wait even to telephone. He came himself to the trust company and told John they needed 2 more bonds for additional margin to protect their loan. But he said it was merely temporary and that they had better even up by buying some more cotton. John went down into the vault and came back with 4 more Overland 4s bonds under his coat. He was in for it now, and might as well be hung for a sheep as for a lamb. He was beginning to get used to the idea of being a thief. He was, to be sure, wretchedly unhappy, but he was experiencing the excitement of trying to dodge fate until fortune looked his way. Cotton still went down. It never occurred to him that Prescott perhaps had not bought all the cotton. Now that he is in prison, he thinks maybe Prescott didn't. But he kept going down into the vault and bringing up more bonds, and getting reckless, bought more cotton, quantities of it. In a month, 60 bonds were gone from the pile of 200. John, a nervous wreck, almost laughed grimly at the joke of his being short 60 bonds. At home they thought he was getting run down. His wife, he was so kind and thoughtful that she had never been so happy. It made her fearful that he had some fatal disease and knew he was going to die. Up at the bank, John made a separate bundle of 60 bonds out of the pile of 600, so that he could substitute them for those first taken if the owner called for them. It was not likely that both owners would call for their bonds on the same day, so that he was practically safe until one or the other had withdrawn his deposit. About this time, the special accountants came around to make their annual investigation. It was apparently done in the regular and usual way. One examiner stood inside the vault and another outside, surrounded by 4 or 5 assistants. They investigated the loans. John brought them out in armfuls, and the accountants checked them off and sent them back. When John brought out the 140 bonds left in the bundle of 200 Overland 4s, he placed on top of them the pile of 60 bonds taken from the other bundle of 600. Then he took them back, shifted over the 60, and brought out the bundle of 600 Overland 4s. Made up in part of the same bonds. It was the easiest thing going. The experts simply counted the 60 bonds twice, and John had the 60 bonds, or Prescott had them, down the street. Later, the same firm of experts certified to the presence of $300,000 of missing bonds, counting the same bundle, not only twice, but 5 and 6 times. You see, Prescott's John had grown wise in his generation. After that, he felt reasonably secure. It did seem almost unbelievable that such a situation could exist, but it was, nevertheless, a fact that it did. He expected momentarily that his theft would be detected, and that he would be thrown into prison. And his fear of the actual arrest, the moment of public ignominy, the shock and agony of his wife and family, were what drove him sleepless into the streets, and every evening to the theaters, to try to forget what must inevitably come. But the fact that he had gone wrong, that he was a thief, that he had betrayed his trust, had lost its edge. He now thought no more of shoving a package of bonds into his overcoat pocket than he did of taking that garment down from its peg behind the door. He knew from inquiry that men who stole a few $100s and were caught usually got as long a term as those who stole thousands. If he stole 1 bond, he was just as likely to get 10 years in state's prison as if he stole 50. So he stole 50. And when they were wiped out, he stole 50 more. And, well, if the reader is interested, he will learn before the end of the story just what John did steal. Somehow, Prescott's speculations never succeeded. Occasionally they would make a good turn and get a few bonds back, but the next week there would be a new fiasco, and John would have to visit the Overland 4s again. That performance of the accountants had given him a huge contempt for bankers and banking. He knew that if he wanted to, he could grab up $1 million any day and walk off with it, but he didn't want to. All he desired now was to get back to where he was before. All the speculation was in the hands of Prescott, and Prescott never seemed worried in the least. He called on John almost daily for what extra bonds were needed as additional collateral, and John took his word absolutely as to the result of the transactions. He could not do otherwise, for one word from Prescott would have ruined him. Before long, the pile of 200 Overland 4s was gone. So was a large quantity of other securities, for John and Prescott had dropped cotton and had gone plunging into the stock market. Here, however, they had no better success than before. Of course, a difficulty arose when the interest on the Overland 4s came due. The coupons had to be cut by someone in the bank, and although John usually cut them, he did not always do so. Sometimes the loan clerk himself would take a hand and call for a particular lot of bonds. John, however, was now fertile in devices. The owner of the larger pile of 600 bonds usually wrote to have his coupons cut about the 27th of April. John would make up a collection of 600 bonds of the same sort, carry them up, and cut the coupons in the loan cage. The other man generally sent in a draft for his interest on the 2nd or 3rd of May. But now the bonds were away, scattered all over the street. So John started a new operation to get the bonds back and straighten out the coupon tangle. He substituted with the brokers an equal number of bonds of other companies, the interest upon which was not yet due. There was a large block of electric 5s and Cumberland 4s, which served his purpose admirably, and thus he kept up with the game. When the coupons became due on the latter, he carried back the first. It kept him and Prescott busy most of the time juggling securities. At least John knew he was kept busy, and Prescott claimed to be equally so. There were many loans of brokers and others, all secured by the same sort of collateral. Most of these John appropriated. When it was necessary to check off the loans, John, having retained enough of the same kind of bonds to cover the largest loan, would bring up the same bundle time after time with a different name upon it. If one of the customers wanted to pay off a loan and his bonds were gone, he would be given someone else's collateral. Apparently, the only thing that was necessary was to have enough of each kind of security on hand to cover the largest loan on the books at any given time. Once, when the examiners were at work on the vault, John had to make up $100,000 in Overland 4s or 5s from the different small loans in the loan vault, and put them in a package in the deposit vault, in order to make it appear that certain depositors' bonds were all there. The most extraordinary performance of all was when, upon one of the annual examinations, John covered the absence of over 50 bonds in the collateral covering a certain loan by merely shoving the balance of the securities into the back of the vault, so that it was not examined at all. He had taken these bonds to substitute for others in different brokers' offices, and it so happened that there were no similar securities in the building. Thus the deficiency could not be covered up even by John's expert sleight of hand. Of course, if there had been other bonds of the same kind in another vault, it would have been a simple matter to substitute them, but there were not. So John pushed the remaining 150 bonds into a dark corner of the vault and awaited the discovery with throbbing pulses. Yet, strange to relate, these watchdogs of finance did not see the bonds which John had hidden, and did not discover that anything was wrong, since, for purposes of its own, the bank had neglected to make any record of the loan in question. It would really have been safer for John if he had taken the whole pile, but then he did not know that the accountants were going to do their business in any such crazy fashion. The whole thing came to seem a sort of joke to John. He never took any bonds for his own personal use. He gave everything to Prescott, and he rarely if ever saw Prescott except to hand him securities. One day Prescott walked right into the bank itself, and John gave him 165 bonds, which he stuffed under his overcoat and carried away. Remember that this is a fact. The thing, which began in August 1905, dragged over through the following year and on into 1907. John weathered 2 examinations by the accountants, the last being in October 1906, when they certified that the company was absolutely okay and everything intact. On that particular day, John had over $300,000 in Overland 4s and 5s scattered over the street. In the first 6 months, they lost $100,000 in cotton. Then they played both sides of the market in stocks and got badly bitten as bears in the temporary bull market in the autumn of 1906, selling Union Pacific at 165, which afterward went to 190, Northern Pacific at 185, which went to 200, etc., etc. Then they shifted their position, became bulls, and went long of stock just at the beginning of the present slump. They bought Reading at 118, American Smelters at 126, Pennsylvania at 130, Union at 145, and Northern Pacific at 180. At one time, John had $550,000 in bonds out of the vault. The thing might have been going on still, had it not been for the fact that the anticipated merger between John's company and another was put through, and a new vault in a new building prepared to receive the securities. Of course, on such an occasion a complete examination would be made of all the securities, and there would be practically no chance to deceive the accountants. Moreover, a part of the securities had actually been moved when the worst slump came, and they needed more. It was obvious that the jig was up. A few more days, and John knew that the gyves would be upon his wrists. Prescott and he took an account of the stock they had lost and went into committee on Ways and Means. Neither had any desire to run away. Wall Street was the breath of life to them. Prescott said that the best thing to do was to take enough more to stand off the company. He cited a case in Boston where a clerk who was badly in was advised by his lawyer to take $125,000 more. Then the lawyer dickered with the bank and brought it to terms. The lawyer got $25,000, the bank got the rest, and the thief was let go. Prescott said they ought to get away with enough more to make the bank's loss $1 million. He thought that would make them see what was the wise thing to do. Prescott also said he would try to get a lawyer who could bring some pressure to bear on the officials of the company. It would be a rather unpleasant situation to have brought to the attention of the state superintendent of banking. John agreed to get the additional securities and turn them over to Prescott. Unfortunately, almost everything had by this time been moved into the new vault, and all John could get was a stock certificate for 15,000 railroad shares standing in his own name and $75,000 in notes. These he gave to Prescott, thus increasing the amount stolen from the bank without discovery to between $600,000 and $700,000. This was on the day before the actuaries were to make their investigation. Knowing that his arrest was now only a question of time, John, about 11 o'clock on the following morning, left the trust company for the last time. He was in telephonic communication with Prescott, who in turn was in touch with their lawyer. Unfortunately, the president of the company had gone out of town over Sunday, so that again their plans went awry. For nearly 2 years, John had not known an hour devoid of haunting fear. From a cheerful and contented youth he had become despondent, taciturn, and nervous. He was the same affectionate husband and attentive son as before, and his general characteristics remained precisely the same. He was scrupulous to a penny in every other department of his life, and undoubtedly would have felt the same pricks of conscience had he been guilty of any other act of dishonesty. The affair at the bank was a thing apart. The embezzler of $600,000 was not John at all, but a separate personality wearing John's clothes and bearing his name. He perceived clearly the enormity of his offense, but because he was the same John in every other respect, he had a feeling that somehow the fact that he had done the thing was purely fortuitous. In other words, that the bonds had to be taken, were going to be taken anyway, and that fate had simply elected him to take them. Surely he had not wanted the bonds, had had no intention of stealing $500,000, and in short was not the kind of a man who would steal $500,000. Each night he tossed sleepless till the light stole in through the shutters. At every corner on his way uptown he glanced over his shoulder behind him. The front doorbell never rang, that his muscles did not become rigid and his heart almost stopped beating. If he went to a theater or upon an excursion, he passed the time wondering if the next day he would still be a free man. In short, he paid in full in physical misery and mental anxiety and wretchedness for the real moral obliquity of his crime. The knowledge of this maddened him for what was coming. Yet he realized that he had stolen $500,000 and that justice demanded that he should be punished for it. After leaving the bank, John called up Prescott and learned that the plan to adjust matters with the president had miscarried by reason of the latter's absence. The two then met in a saloon, and here it was arranged that John should call up the loan clerk and tell him that something would be found to be wrong at the bank, but that nothing had better be said about it until the following Monday morning, when the president would return. The loan clerk, however, refused to talk with him and hung up the receiver. John had nowhere to go, for he dared not return home, and spent the afternoon until 6 o'clock riding in streetcars and sitting in saloons. At that hour he again communicated with Prescott, who said that he had secured rooms for him and his wife at a certain hotel, where they might stay until matters could be fixed up. John arranged to meet his wife at 42nd Street with Prescott and conduct her to the hotel. As fate decreed, The loan clerk came out of the subway at precisely the same time, saw them together, and followed them. Meantime, a hurry call had been sent for the president, who had returned to the city. John, fully aware that the end had come, went to bed at the hotel, and for the first time since the day he had taken the bonds 2 years before, slept soundly. At 3 the next morning there came a knock at the door. His wife awakened him, and John opened it. As he did so, a policeman forced his way in, and the loan clerk, who stood in the corridor just behind him, exclaimed theatrically, "Officer, there is your man." John is now in prison, serving out the sentence which the court believed it necessary to inflict upon him as a warning to others. Prescott is also serving a term at hard labor, a sentence somewhat longer than John's. The trust company took up their accounts, paid the losses of the luckless pair, and, owing to a rise in prices which came too late to benefit the latter, escaped with the comparatively trifling loss of little over $100,000. At once every banking house and trust company upon the street looked to its system of checks upon the honesty of its employees, and took precautions which should have been taken long before. The story was a 9 days' wonder. Then Union Pacific dropped 20 points more, the tide of finance closed over the heads of John and Prescott, and they were forgotten. Had the company, instead of putting itself at the mercy of a $35 a week clerk, placed double combinations on the loan and deposit vaults and employed 2 men, one to act as a check upon the other, to handle its securities, or had it merely adopted the even simpler expedient of requiring an officer of the company to be present when any securities were to be removed from the vaults, John would probably not now be in jail. It would seem that it would not be a difficult or complicated matter to employ a doorkeeper, who did not have access himself, to stand at the door of the vault and check off all securities removed therefrom or returned thereto. An officer of the bank should personally see that the loans earned up to the cage in the morning were properly returned to the vaults at night and secured with a time lock. Such a precaution would not cost the stockholders 0.1% in dividends. It is a trite saying that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But this is as true, in the case of financial institutions at least, from the point of view of the employee as of the company. It is an ingenious expedient to insure oneself with a Fidelity Corporation against the possible defalcations of one's servants, and doubtless certain risks can only be covered in some such fashion. These methods are eminently proper so far as they go, but they, unfortunately, do not serve the public purpose of protecting the weak from undue and unnecessary temptation. Banks and trust companies are prone to rely on the fact that most peculations are easily detected and severely punished, but the public interest demands that all business, state, municipal, and private, should be so conducted that dishonesty may not only be punished, but prevented. A builder who took a chance on the strength of a girder would have small credit in his profession. A good bridge is one which will bear the strain, not only of the pedestrian, but of the elephant. A deluge or an earthquake may occur and the bridge may tumble, but next time it is built stronger and better. Thus science progresses and the public interest is subserved. A driver who overloads his beast is regarded as a fool or a brute. Perhaps such names are too harsh for those who overload the moral backbone of an inexperienced subordinate. Surely the fault is not all on one side. While there are no formulas to calculate the resiliency of the human character, we may demand the same prudence on the part of the officers of financial institutions as we do from nursemaids, lumbermen, and manufacturers of explosives. Though we may have confidence in the rectitude of our fellows, we have no right to ignore the limitations and weaknesses of mankind. It would not outrage the principles of justice if one who placed needless and disproportionate strain upon the morals of another were himself regarded as an accessory to the crime. End of Chapter 6. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Chapter 7 of True Stories of Crime from the District Attorney's Office by Arthur Cheney Train. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Colleen McMahon. The Duc de Nevers. And God gives to every man the virtue, temper, understanding, taste, that lifts him into life and lets him fall just in the niche he was ordained to fill. The Task. Cooper. One morning there lay on my desk a note finely written in pencil and dated. Tombs Prison. Monsieur, would you be so gracious as to extend to the undersigned the courtesy of a private interview in your office? I have a communication of the highest importance to make to you. Respectfully, Charles Julius Francis de Nevers. Across the street in the courtyard, the prisoners were taking their daily exercise. 2 by 2 they marched slowly around the enclosure, in the center of which a small bed of geraniums struggled bravely in mortal combat with the dust and grime of Center Street. Some of the prisoners walked with heads erect and shoulders thrown back. Others slouched along, with their arms dangling and their chins resting upon their chests. When one of them failed to keep up with the rest, a keeper, who stood in the shade by a bit of ivy in a corner of the wall, got after him. Somehow the note on the desk did not seem to fit any one of the gentry whom I could see so distinctly from my window. The name, too, did not have the customary Tombs sound. De Nevers, de Nevers. I repeated it slowly to myself with varying accent. It seemed as though I had known the name before. It carried with it a suggestion of the novels of Stanley J. Weyman, of books on old towns in the chateaux and cathedrals of France. I wondered who the devil Charles Julius Francis de Nevers could be. Of course, if one answered all the letters one gets from the Tombs, it would keep a secretary busy most of the working hours of the day. And if one acceded to all the various requests the prisoners make to interview them personally, or to see their fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, sweethearts, and wives, a prosecutor might as well run an intelligence office and be done with it. But as I reread the note, I began to have a sneaking feeling of curiosity, to see what Charles Julius Francis de Nevers looked like. So I departed from the usual rule of my office, rang for a messenger, and directed him to ascertain the full name of the prisoner from whom the note had come, the crime with which he was charged, and the date of his incarceration, also to supply me at once with copies of the indictment and the complaint. Then I instructed him to have de Nevers brought over as soon as he could be got into shape. I had almost forgotten that I was expecting a visitor when, a couple of hours later, an undersized deputy sheriff entered my office and reported that he had a prisoner in his custody for whom I had sent to the Tombs. Glancing up from my desk, I saw standing behind his keeper a tall and distinguished-looking man in fashionably cut garments, whose well-shaped head and narrow face, thin aquiline nose, and carefully trimmed pointed beard seemed to bespeak somewhat different antecedents from those of the ordinary occupant of a cell in the city prison. I should have instinctively risen from my chair and offered my aristocratic-looking visitor a chair, had not the keeper unconsciously brought me to a realization of my true position by remarking, "Say, counselor, I guess while you're talking to his nibs I'll step out into the hall and take a smoke." "Certainly," said I, glad to be rid of him. "I will be responsible for the prisoner." Then, as the keeper hesitated in putting his suggestion into execution, I reached into the upper right-hand drawer of my desk, produced 2 of what are commonly known in the parlance of the criminal courts buildings as cigars, and handed them to him. "Well," said I, after the keeper had departed, closing the door behind him, and leaving the visitor standing in the middle of the office, "I have sent for you, as you requested, and shall be glad to hear anything you have to say. Of course, any communication which you may see fit to make to me is voluntary, and, in the event for your trial for any crime with which you may be charged, may be used against you." I had a certain feeling of embarrassment in making this customary declaration, since the whole idea of this person being a criminal was so incongruous as to put a heavy strain on one's credulity. However, I recalled that a certain distinguished Englishman of letters has declared that there is no essential incongruity between crime and culture. He acknowledged my remark with a slight smile of half-amused deprecation, and with a courteous bow took the seat to which I motioned him. "I wish to thank you," he said in excellent English, marked by the slightest possible suggestion of a foreign accent, "for your exceeding courtesy in responding so quickly to my request. I am aware," he added, "that it is unusual for prisoners to seek interviews with the, what shall I say, juge d'instruction, as we call him, but," he added with a smile, "I think you will find that mine is an unusual affair." I had already begun to think so, and, reaching to the upper drawer on the left-hand side of my desk, I produced from the box reserved for judges, prominent members of the bar, borough presidents, commissioners of departments, and distinguished foreigners, a Havana of the variety known in our purlieus as a good cigar, and tendered the same to him. "Ah," he said, "many thanks, merci, non, I do not smoke the cigar. Monsieur perhaps has a cigarette? Monsieur will pardon me if I say that this is the first act of kindness which has been accorded to me since my incarceration 3 weeks ago." Somewhere I found a box of cigarettes, one of which he removed, gracefully holding it between fingers which I noticed were singularly white and delicate, and lighting it with the air of a diplomat at an international conference. "You can hardly appreciate," he ventured, "the humiliation to which I, an officer and a gentleman of France, have been subjected." I lighted the cigar, which he had declined, and, with mingled feelings of embarrassment, distrust, and curiosity, inquired if his name was Charles Julius Francis de Nevers. I wish it were possible to describe the precise look which flashed across his face as he answered my question. "That is my name," he said, "or, at least, rather, I am Charles Julius Francis, and I am of Nevers. May I speak confidentially? Were my family to be aware of my present situation, they would never recover from the humiliation and disgrace connected with it." "Certainly," said I. "Anything which you may tell me, which you wish to be kept confidential, I will treat as such, provided, of course, that what you tell me is the truth." "You shall hear nothing else," he replied. Then, leaning back in his chair, he said simply, and with great dignity, "I am, by direct inheritance today, the Duc de Nevers, my father, the last duke, having died in the month of February 1905. Any such announcement would ordinarily have filled me with amusement, but that the gentleman sitting before me should declare himself to be a duke or even a prince seemed entirely natural. "Indeed," said I, unable to think of any more appropriate remark. "Yes," said de Nevers, "and monsieur is naturally surprised that one of my distinguished position should be now a tenant of an American jail. But if monsieur will do me the honor of listening for a few moments, I will explain my present extraordinary predicament. I am Charles Julius François, eldest son of the late Oscar Oudin, Duc de Nevers, Grand Commander of the Legion of Honor and Knight of the Garter. I was born in Paris in the year 1860, at 148 Rue Champs-Élysées. My mother, the Dowager Duchess, is now residing at the Château de Nevers in the province of Nièvre in France. My sister Jean married Prince Henry of Arenberg and now lives in Brussels, at the Palais d'Arenberg, situated at the corner of the Rue de Regence near the Palais de Justice. My sister Louise, the Countess of Kilkenny, is living in Ireland. My sister Camille married the Marquis of Londonderry and is residing in London at the present time. My sister Evelyn married the Earl of Dudley and is living in Dublin. I have one other sister, Marie, who is with my mother. My brother, Count André de Nevers, is at present naval attaché in Berlin. My brother Fernand is an officer of artillery stationed in Madagascar, and my youngest brother Marcel is also an officer of artillery, attached to the 8th Regiment in Nancy. I make this statement, by way of introduction, in order that you may understand fully my situation. During my childhood I had an English tutor in Paris, and when I reached the age of 10 years I was sent by my father to the Collège Louis le Grand, where I took the course of Science and Letters, and graduated from the Lycée with the degree of bachelor on the 5th of August, 1877. Having passed my examination for the Polytechnic, I remained there 2 years, and on my graduation received a commission as sous-lieutenant of engineers, and immediately entered the application school at Fontainebleau, where I was graduated in 1881 as lieutenant of engineers and assigned to the 1st Regiment of Engineers at Versailles. De Nevers paused and exhaled the cigarette smoke. "Monsieur will pardon me if I go into detail, for only in that way will he be convinced of the accuracy of what I am telling him." "Pray go on," said I. "If what you tell me is true, your case is extraordinary indeed." "My first act of service," continued de Nevers, "was on the 10th of August, when I was sent to Tonkin. I will not trouble you with the details of my voyage on the transport to China, but will simply state that I was wounded in the engagement at Yung Chuang on the 7th of November of the same year, and had the distinction of receiving the Cross of the Legion of Honor therefor. I was immediately furloughed back to France, where I entered the Superior School of War and took my Staff Major brevet. At the same time I seized the opportunity to follow the course of the Sorbonne, and secured the additional degree of Doctor of Science. I had received an excellent education in my youth and always had a taste for study, which I have taken pains to pursue in whatever part of the world I happen to be stationed. As a result, I am able to converse with considerable fluency in English, as perhaps you have already observed, as well as in Spanish, Italian, German, Russian, Arabic, and, to a considerable extent, in Japanese. In 1883 I was sent to Berlin as military attaché, but was subsequently recalled because I had violated the rules of international etiquette by fighting 3 duels with German officers. The ambassador at this time was Charles de Courcelles. You will understand that there was no disgrace connected with my recall, but the necessity of defending my honor was incompatible with the rules of the service, and after 15 months in Berlin, I was remanded to Versailles with the rank of first lieutenant under Colonel Quinivet. Here I pursued my studies, and was then ordered to the Sudan, whence, after being wounded, I was sent to Senegal. Here I acted as governor of the city of St. Louis. As you are doubtless aware, the climate of Senegal is exceedingly unhealthy. I fell ill with a fever and was obliged to return to France, where I was assigned to the office of the General Staff Major in Paris. At the opening of the war with Dahomey in 1892, I was sent in command of the engineers of the Corps Expeditionnaire, and on the 17th of November of that year was severely wounded at Dakar in Dahomey, having received a spear cut through the lungs. On this occasion I had the distinction of being promoted as Major of Engineers, and was created an officer of the Legion of Honor on the battlefield. The wound in my lungs was of such a serious character that Colonel Dodds sent me back once more to France on furlough, and President Carnot was kind enough to give me his personal commendation for my services. I was now 33 years old, and had already attained high rank in my profession. I had had opportunity to pursue studies in chemistry, medicine, and science, and my only interest was in the service of my country, and in qualifying myself for my future duties. My life, up to that time, had been uniformly happy. I was the eldest son, and beloved both of my father and mother. My social position gave me the entrée to the best of society wherever I happened to be. As yet, however, I had never been in love. At this time occurred the affair which in a measure changed my career. The wound in my lungs was slow in healing, and at the earnest invitation of my sister, Lady Londonderry, I went to London. At that time she was living in Belgravia Square. It was here I met my first wife. De Nevers paused. The cigarette had gone out. For the first time he seemed to lose perfect control of himself. I busied myself with some papers, until he should have regained his self-possession. "You will understand," he said in a few moments. "These things are not governed by law and statute. The woman with whom I fell in love, and who was in every respect the equal in intellectual attainments, beauty, and charm of manner of my own people, was the nursery governess in my sister's household. She returned my affection and agreed to marry me. The proposed marriage excited the utmost antipathy on the part of my family. My fiancé was dismissed from my sister's household, and I returned to Paris with the intention of endeavoring by every means in my power to induce my father to permit me to wed the woman I loved. It is doubtless difficult for Monsieur to appreciate the position of a French officer. In America, America is free, one can marry the woman one loves. But in France no officer can marry without the consent of the Minister of War and of the President of the Republic. And more than that, he cannot marry unless his intended wife possesses a dowry of at least 50,000 francs, which must be deposited with the Minister of War for investment. In spite of the fact that I enjoyed the confidence and friendship of President Carnot, the latter, at my father's request, refused me permission to marry. There was no choice left for me but to resign my commission, and this I did. I returned to England and was married at St. Thomas's Church, London, on the 21st of June, 1893. My education as an engineer had been of the most highly technical and thorough character, and I had every reason to believe that in America I could earn a comfortable living. My wife and I therefore sailed for America immediately after our marriage. I first secured a position in some iron works in South Boston, and for a time lived happily. A boy, Oscar, named after my father, was born to us while we were living in the town of Winchester, near Boston. Another son was born a year later in the same place, and still a third in Pittsburgh, where I had gone to assume the position of general foreman of the Homestead Steel Works, and assistant master mechanic of the Carnegie Steel Company. I rapidly secured the confidence of my employers, and was sent upon several occasions to study new processes in different parts of the country. During one of my vacations we returned to England and visited my wife's people, who lived in Manchester. Here she died on the 17th of June, 1901. De Nevers paused again, and it was some moments before he continued. After the death of my wife, my father expressed himself as ready for a reconciliation, but although this took place, I had not the heart to remain in France. I liked America, and had attained distinction in my profession. I therefore expressed my intention of returning to continue my career as an engineer, but at the earnest solicitation of my father, left my 3 children with my parents. They are now living at the château of my mother at Nièvre. I was sent to Chicago to study a new blast furnace, and 2 years later, when Mr. Schwab organized the Russo-American Company at Mariupol, South Siberia, he offered me the position of general manager, which I accepted. Here I remained until November 1904, when all of the American engineers were arrested and imprisoned on the order of General Kozubsky of the Russian engineers, who at the same time shot and murdered my assistant, Thomas D. MacDonald, for refusing to allow him to remove pig iron from the storehouse without giving a receipt for it. Ambassador McCormick secured our immediate release, and we returned to the States. Monsieur has no idea of the power of these Russian officers. The murder of my assistant was of the most brutal character. Kozubsky came to my office and demanded the iron, but having secured it, refused to sign the receipt which MacDonald presented to him. MacDonald said, "You shall not remove the iron if you do not sign the receipt." As he spoke the words, the general drew his revolver and shot him down like a dog. I returned to America in January 1905, and have since then been doing work as a consulting engineer. Last January I visited my parents in Paris at their home at 148 Champs-Élysées. You have doubtless seen the mansion with its 2 gates and black railing of decorative iron. I had no sooner returned to America than I received a cable announcing the death of my father. De Nevers removed from his breast pocket a bundle of carefully folded papers, from which he produced a sheet of heavy stationery, with a deep border of mourning and a large black cross at the top, of which the following is a copy. Her Grace the Duchess Dowager of Nevers, His Grace the Duke Charles J.F. of Nevers and his children, Oscar, Hilda, and John, Their Highnesses the Prince and Princess Henry of Arenberg, Captain the Count André of Nevers, Captain the Count Fernand of Nevers, the Earl and Countess of Kilkenny, the Marquis and Marchioness of Londonderry, the Earl and Countess of Dudley, the Countess Marie of Nevers, Lieutenant the Count Marcel of Nevers, have the sorrow to announce the subite death, at the family seat at Nevers, France, of His Grace Oscar Oudon, Duke of Nevers, Grand Commander of the Legion of Honor, Knight of the Garter. Their husband, father, grandfather, and uncle beloved. Masonic burial shall take place at Nevers on Tuesday, February 21st, 1905. New York, February 20th, 1905, USA. The announcement was carefully engraved, and was of an expensive character, and I read it with considerable interest. Does Monsieur care to see the photographs of my family? Here, producing a photograph of a gentleman and a lady and a group of children, is my wife with the 3 children, taken in London just before she died. Another group, bearing the trademark of a Parisian photographer, exhibited a distinguished-looking man surrounded by a group of many children of varying ages. "These," said De Nevers, "are my father and my brothers and sisters." Then came photographs of Lady Londonderry and the Earl and Countess of Dudley. My interest in my visitor's story had for the moment completely driven from my mind the real object of the interview, which ostensibly was to explain the reason for his incarceration. His straightforward narrative carried absolute conviction with it. That he was the legitimate Duc de Nevers I accepted without hesitation. That he was a man of education, culture, and many accomplishments was self-evident. "You have had an extraordinary career," I ventured. "Yes," he replied. "It has been a life of action, and I may say, of suffering. Permit me to show you the certificate of my general that what I have told you is accurate." And De Nevers unfolded from his pocket a document bearing a seal of the French Ministry of War, which read as follows: République Française, Ministère de la Guerre, Cabinet du Ministère, No. 195, Paris, October 24th, 1901. To whom it may concern. I, George André, General of Division of Engineers, Minister of War of the French Republic, certify that the Lieutenant Colonel Charles Jules Comte François de Nevers is connected with the French army since the 10th day of September, 1877, and that the following is a true copy of his record. Born in Paris, the 10th of June, 1859. Graduated, Bachelor of Sciences and Letters, from the Lycée Louis le Grand, the 5th of August, 1877. Received first as Chief of Promotion of the National Polytechnic School of France, the 10th of September, 1877. Graduated with the greatest distinction from the above school, the 1st of September, 1879. Entered the Application School of Military Engineers at Fontainebleau as Second Lieutenant, Chief of Promotion, the 15th of September, 1879. Graduated as Lieutenant of Engineers with great distinction, the 1st of August, 1881, and sent to the 1st Regiment of Engineers at Versailles. Sent to Tonkin the 1st day of August, 1881. Wounded at Yungchuang, Tonkin, the 7th of November, 1881. Inscribed on the Golden Book of the French Army, the 10th of November, 1881. Made Knight of the Legion of Honor, the 10th of November, 1881. Wounded at Suisang, the 4th of January, 1882. Sent to Switzerland in mission, where he was graduated at the Zurich Polytechnic University as Mechanical Engineer, 1884. Sent the 2nd of January, 1885 to Sudan. Wounded there twice. Made Captain of Engineers the 3rd of June, 1885. Called back to France the 6th of September, 1885. Sent in mission in Belgium, where he was graduated as Electrical Engineer from the Montefiore University at Liège. Made Officer of Academy. Sent in Gabon the 2nd of May, 1887. Wounded twice. Constructed there the military railroad. Sent to Senegal as Commander the 6th of July, 1888, to organize administration. Wounded once. Called back and sent to Germany the 7th of December, 1889. Called back from Germany and assigned to the Creusot as Assistant Chief Engineer. Sent to Dahomey the 1st of January, 1891. Wounded the 19th of November, 1892 at Dahomey. Made Major of Engineers on the battlefield. Made Officer of the Legion of Honor on the battlefield. By special decision of the Senate and the Chamber of Representatives, the name of Commandant Charles Jules Comte François de Nevers is embroidered the 21st of November on the flag of the Regiment of Engineers. Called back and sent to Algeria the 3rd of January, 1893. Made Ordnance of the President Carnot the 5th of February, 1893. Sent to the Creusot the 1st of July, 1893 as Director. Sent to Madagascar the 2nd of April, 1894 in command of the Engineers. Wounded the 12th of July, 1894 at Majungwa. Made Lieutenant Colonel of Engineers the 12th of July, 1894 on the battlefield. Proposed as Commander of the Legion of Honor on the same date. Called back and sent as Ordnance Officer of the General-in-Chief in command in Algeria the 4th of March, 1896. Sent to America in special mission to the Klondike the 7th of July, 1897. Put on disponibility hors cadre on his demand the 1st of November, 1897. Made Honorary Member of the National Defenses, commissioned the 28th of January, 1898. Made Honorary Member of the Commission on Railroads, Canals, and Harbors the 7th of July, 1899. Made Honorary Member of the Commission on Bridges and Highways the 14th of July, 1900. Made Corresponding Member of the Academy of Sciences the 14th of July, 1901. Made Commander of the Legion of Honor the 22nd of October, 1901. I will say further that the Lieutenant Colonel Charles Jules Comte François de Nevers is regarded as one of our best and most loyal officers, that he has the good will and best wishes of the government and of all his fellow officers, and is considered by everybody as a great worker and a thoroughly honest man. I personally will be pleased to do anything in my power to help him in any business he may undertake, and can recommend him to everybody as a responsible and trustworthy engineer, knowing him for the last 24 years. Gio André, Minister of War. Seal. The document seemed in substance merely a repetition of what de Nevers had already told me, and I handed it back to him, satisfied of its correctness. But public business is public business, and if the Duc de Nevers had anything to communicate to me in my official character, it was time for him to do so. "Well, Duke," said I, not knowing very well how otherwise to address him, "do you desire to communicate anything to me in connection with your present attention in the tombs?" "Ah," he said, with a gesture of deprecation, "I can hardly understand that myself. Perhaps monsieur has the papers. Ah, yes, I see they are on his desk. Monsieur will observe that I am accused of the crime of— what is it called in English? Ah, yes, perjury, but I assure monsieur that is entirely mistake. I picked up the indictment, and found that the grand jury of the county of New York accused one Charles de Nevers of the crime of perjury committed as follows: that one William Douglas, having been arrested by William W. Crawford, a member of the police force of the city of New York, upon the charge of having violated the motor vehicle law of the state of New York, ordinance against speeding, he, the said Charles de Nevers, had then and there offered himself to go bail for the said Douglas, and did sign a certain written undertaking called a bond, for the appearance of the said Douglas before the magistrate, wherein he swore that he owned a certain house and lot situate at 122 West 117th Street, in the county of New York, which was free and clear of all encumbrances, and of the value of not less than $20,000. Whereas in truth and in fact he, the said Charles de Nevers, did not own the said house and lot, which did not then and there stand in the name of him, the said Charles de Nevers, but was the property of one Helen M. Bent, and so recorded in the registry of deeds. Which, said the grand jury, Charles de Nevers then and there well knew. And so they accused him of feloniously, knowingly, wilfully, corruptly, and falsely committing the crime of perjury, against the form of the statute in such cases made and provided, and against the peace of the people of the state of New York and their dignity. And this they did over the signature of William Travers Jerome, District Attorney. How did this happen? I inquired, hardly believing my senses. Was it a fact that you made this false statement to the police for the purpose of securing bail for Mr. Douglas? De Nevers leaned forward and was about to answer, when a messenger entered the room and stated that I was wanted in the court. Another time, if monsieur will permit me, said he. I have much to thank you for. If monsieur will give me another hearing, it shall be my pleasure to explain fully. I rose and summoned the keeper. De Nevers bowed and offered his hand, which I took. I have much to thank you for, he repeated. As I hurried out of the room, I encountered the keeper outside the door. Say, counselor, what sort of a con was he throwing into you? He inquired with a wink. De Nevers was well inside my office, looking drearily out of my window towards the courtyard and the tombs, where his fellows were still pursuing their weary march. What do you mean? I asked. Why, who did his nibs tell you he was? The Duc de Nevers, I replied. Say, said O'Toole, you don't mean you swallowed that, do you? Do you know what that feller did? Why, one afternoon when a swell guy and his girl were out in their gas wagon, a mounted cop in the park pulls them in and takes them over to the 57th Street Court. Well, just as me friend is taking them into the house, along walks this Charlie Nevers, with his tall silk hat and pearl-handle cane, with a flower in his buttonhole, and his black coat-tails dangling around his heels, just like Bonnie de Castellane, and says he, Officer, says he, may I inquire what for you're apprehending this gentleman and lady, says he. With that me friend hands him out some strong language for butting in, and Charlie is so much shocked at the insult to himself and the lady that he steps in before the sergeant and offers to go bond for Douglas, just to go the cop one better, giving the sergeant the same line of drip that he's been handing out to us in the tombs, about his being the son of Oscar the Duc de Nevers and related to all the crowned heads in Europe. Then he ups and signs the bail bond for a house and lot that he has never seen in his life, and here he is up agin it. And it's a good stiff one his honor'll be handing out to him, to my way of thinking, for these highfalutin foreigners has got to be put a stop to, and Charlie Nevers is a good one to begin on. I think you're wrong, O'Toole, said I, but we can tell better later on. All that day my thoughts kept reverting to the Duc de Nevers. One thing was more than certain, and that was that of all the various personages whom I had met during my journey through the world, none was more fitted to be a duke than he. I was obliged to confess that during my hour's interview I had felt myself to be in the company of a superior being, one of different clay from that of which I was composed, a man of better brain and better education, vastly more rounded and experienced, a cultivated citizen of the world, who would be at home in any company no matter how distinguished, and who would rise to any emergency. As I ate my dinner at the club, the name de Nevers played mistily in the recesses of my memory. De Nevers, surely there was something historic about it, some flavor of the days of kings and courtiers. Smoking my cigar in the library, I fell into a reverie in which the Tombs, with its towers and grated windows, figured as a grey chateau of old Touraine, and Charles Julius Francis in hunting costume as a medieval Monseigneur with a hooded falcon on his wrist. I awoke to find directly in my line of vision upon the shelf of the alcove in front of me the solid phalanx of the 10 volumes of Larousse's Grand Dictionnaire Univers du 19e siècle, and I reached forward and pulled down the letter N. Nevers. There it was, capital of the department of Nièvre, ducal palace built in 1475. Charles III de Gazagnes, petit-fils de Charles II, had sold the Duchy of Nevers and his other domains in France to Cardinal Mazarin par acte du July 11, 1659. So far so good. The cardinal had left the duchy by will to Philippe Jules François Mancini, his nephew, who had died May 8, 1707. Ah, Julius Francis. It was like meeting an old friend. Philippe Jules François Mancini. Mazarin had obtained letters confirming him in the possession of the Duchy of Nivernais and Danzois in 1720. Then he had died in 1768, leaving the duchy to Louis-Jules Bourbon Mancini Mazzarini. This son, who was the last Duke of Nivernais, had died in 1798. He was the last of the name, said Larousse. I rubbed my eyes. It was there fast enough, last of the name. Something was wrong. Without getting up, I rang for a copy of Burke's Peerage. Londonderry, Marquess of, married October 2nd, 1875, Lady Teresa Susie Helen, Lady of Grace of St. John of Jerusalem, eldest daughter of the 19th Earl of Shrewsbury. Dear me. Dudley, Earl of, married September 14, 1891, Rachel, Lady of Grace of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, youngest daughter of Charles Henry Gurney. I closed the book and began to think, and the more I thought, the more I wondered. There really didn't seem particular need of going further. If the fellow was a fraud, he was a fraud, that was all. But how in heaven's name could a man make up a story like that? That night I dreamed once more of the ducal palace of Nivernais, only its courtyard resembled that of the Tombs, and many couples walked in a straggling line beneath its walls. A day or two passed, and I had heard no more of the Duke Charles Julius, when one afternoon a lady called at my office and sent in her name as Mrs. de Nevers. She proved to be an attractive young woman, a little over 20, dressed in black, whose face showed that she had suffered more than a little. She explained that her husband was confined in the Tombs on a charge of perjury. But that was not all. He was worse than a perjurer. He was an impostor, a bigamist. He had another wife living somewhere in England. In Manchester, she thought. Oh, it was too terrible. He had told her that he was the Count Charles de Nevers, eldest son of the Duc de Nevers, in France, you know, and she had believed him. He had had letters to everybody in Montreal, her home, and plenty of money and beautiful clothes. He had dazzled her completely. The wedding had been quite an affair, and presents had come from the Duke and Duchess of Nevers, from the Marquess of Londonderry, and from the Countess of Dudley. There were also letters from the Prince and Princess of Aremberg in Belgium, and the Counts André and Fernand of Nevers. It had all been so wonderful and romantic. Then they had gone on their wedding journey and had been ecstatically happy. In Chicago they had been received with open arms. That was before the death of the Duke. Yes, her mourning was for the Duke. She smiled sadly. I think she still more than half believed that she was a duchess, and she deserved to be if ever any girl did. Then all of a sudden their money had given out, and the Duke had been arrested for not paying their hotel bill. Perhaps I would like to see a newspaper clipping. It was dreadful. She was ashamed to be seen anywhere after that. She had even been obliged to pawn his Cross of the Legion of Honor, the Leopold Cross of Belgium, and another beautiful decoration which he had been accustomed to wear when they went out to dinner. This was the clipping. Chicago society the dupe of bogus count. Hotel and several whilom friends filled with regret. The count arrested. Chicago, January 29th. Count Charles Julius François de Nevers was in the police court today for defrauding the auditorium annex of a board bill. The Count came to the French consul, Monsieur Henri Maron, amply supplied with credentials. He posed as consulting engineer of the United States Steel Corporation. He was introduced into all the clubs, including the Alliance Française, where he was entertained and spoke on literature. He was accompanied by a charming young countess, and the honors showered upon them and the adulation paid by society tuft hunters was something they will never forget. They returned the entertainments. The Count borrowed several $1,000s. President Ferber of the Olympic Games said today of the Count, "This man confided to me that he had invented a machine for perpetual motion, the chief difficulty of which was that it accumulated energy so fast that it could not be controlled. He asked me to invest in some of his schemes, which I refused to do." The fate of the Count is still pending, and he was led back to a cell. He has been a week behind the bars. The Countess is in tears. "The Countess is me," she explained. "Was he sent to prison?" I asked. "Oh, no," she answered. "You see, they really couldn't tell whether he was a count or not, so they had to let him go." "He ought to be hung," I cried. "I really think he ought," she answered. "You see, it is quite embarrassing, because legally I have never been married at all, have I?" "I don't know," I answered, lying like a gentleman. "Time enough to look that up later." "I found out afterwards," she said, apparently somewhat encouraged, "that his first wife was a nursemaid in London." "Yes," said I, "he told me so himself." Just then there came a knock at my door, and O'Toole appeared. "How are you, Counselor?" he said with a grin. "You know Charlie Nevere? Well, of all the pious frauds. Say, Counselor, ain't he the cute feller? What do you suppose now? I got his record today. Cast your eye over it." I did. This is it. Number 98, number B7721, the Central Office, Bureau of Detectives, Police Department of the City of New York, 300 Mulberry Street. Name, Charles Francois. Alias, Count de Nevers. Date of arrest, 1903. Place of arrest, London, England. Cause of arrest, false pretenses. Name of court, Sessions. To what prison? Penal servitude. Term of imprisonment, 18 months. Remarks, fraudulently obtained motor car in London, under pretense that he was Charles Duc de Nevers, son of Oscar, Prince de Nevers. "So he's an ex-convict," I exclaimed. "He's more than that," cried O'Toole. "He's a bird." I turned to Mrs. de Nevers, or whoever she legally was. "How did he come to do such a foolish thing as to offer to go on the bail bond of a perfect stranger? What good could it do him? He was sure to be caught." "I don't know," said she. "He was always doing things like that. He wanted to seem fine and grand, I guess. We always traveled in style. Why, the afternoon he signed the bond, he came home and told me how the police had been troubling a gentleman who had a lady with him in an automobile, and how he was able to settle the whole affair without the slightest difficulty and send them on their way. He was quite pleased about it." "But why do you suppose he did it?" "He just thought he'd do 'em a favor," suggested O'Toole, "and in that way get in with 'em, and take their money later, mebbe." "Who is he? Do you know?" I asked the girl. "I haven't the vaguest idea," she sighed. A week later Charles Julius Francis stood at the bar of justice, convicted of perjury. His degradation had wrought no change in the dignity of his bearing, or the impassiveness of his general appearance, and he received the sentence of the court without a tremor, and with shoulders thrown back and head erect, as befitted a scion of a noble house. "There's just one thing for me to do with you, Charles Francis," said the judge rudely, "and that is to send you to state prison for a term of 5 years at hard labor." Francis made no sign. "There is one other thing I should like to know, however," continued his Honor, "and that is who you really are." The prisoner bowed slightly. "I am Charles Julius Francis," he replied quietly, "Duc de Nevers and Commander of the Legion of Honor." End of Chapter 7. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Chapter 8 of True Stories of Crime from the District Attorney's Office by Arthur Cheney Train. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Colleen McMahon. A Finder of Missing Heirs. The professional prosecutor is continually surprised at the insignificant amount of crime existing in comparison with the extraordinary scope of criminal opportunity. To be sure, the number of crimes actually detected is infinitesimal as contrasted with those committed. But even so, the conviction constantly grows that the world is astonishingly honest when one considers the unlikelihood that any specific prospective offense will be discovered. How few dishonest servants there are, for example, out of the million or so composing that class of persons, who have an unlimited opportunity to snap up not only unconsidered trifles, but personal property of great value. The actual honesty of the servants is probably greater than that of the masters in the final analysis. Men are not only presumed to be innocent in the eyes of the law, but are found to be so as a matter of daily experience. so far as honesty in the ordinary affairs of life is concerned, and the fact that we rely so implicitly upon the truthfulness and integrity of our fellows is the principal reason why violations of this imperative social law should be severely dealt with. If it were possible adequately to determine or deal with any such issue, mere lying should be made a crime. It is a matter of constant wonder that shrewd businessmen will put through all sorts of deals, when thousands of dollars are at stake, relying entirely upon the word of some single person whom they do not in fact know. John Smith is looking for a house. He finds one he likes with an old lady, who says her name is Sarah Jones, living in it, and offers her $40,000 for her real estate. She accepts. His lawyer searches the title and finds that Sarah Jones is the owner of record. The old lady is invited to the lawyer's office, executes a warranty deed, and goes off with the $40,000. Now, in a great number of instances, no one really knows whether the aged dame is Sarah Jones or not, and she perhaps may be, and sometimes is, only the caretaker's second cousin, who is looking after the house in the latter's absence. There are thousands of acres of land and hundreds of millions of money waiting at compound interest to be claimed by unknown heirs or next of kin. Even if the real ones cannot be found, one would think that this defect could be easily supplied by some properly ingenious person. My Uncle Bill went to sea in '45 and was never heard from again. Will you find out if he left any money? Wrote a client to the author. Careful search failed to reveal any money. But if the money had been found first, how easy it would have been to turn up a nephew. Yet the industry of producing properly authenticated nephews, heirs, legatees, next of kin, and claimants of all sorts has never been adequately developed. There are plenty of agents who, for a moderate fee, will inform you whether or not there is a fortune waiting for you, but there is no agency within the writer's knowledge which will supply an heir for every fortune. From a business point of view, the idea seems to have possibilities. Some few years after the Civil War, a Swede named Ebbe Peterson emigrated to this country to better his condition. Fortune smiled upon him, and he amassed a modest bank account, which, with considerable foresight, he invested in a large tract of unimproved land in the region known as the Bronx, New York City. In the summer of 1888, Peterson determined to take a vacation and revisit Sweden, and accordingly deeded all his real estate to his wife. Just before starting, he decided to take his wife and only child, a little girl of 10 or 12, with him. Accordingly, they set sail from Hoboken Saturday, August 11th, upon the steamer Geyser of the Thingvalla line bound for Copenhagen. At 4 o'clock Tuesday morning, at a point 30 miles south of Sable Island and 200 miles out of Halifax, the Geyser, in the midst of a thick fog, crashed suddenly into a sister ship, the Thingvalla, of the same line, and sank. The Thingvalla was herself badly crippled, but, after picking up 31 survivors, managed to limp into Halifax, from which port the rescued were brought to New York. Only 14 of the Geyser's passengers had been saved, and the Petersons were not among them. They were never heard of again, and no relatives came forward to claim their property, which, happening to be in the direct line of the city's development, was in course of time mapped out into streets and house lots, and became exceedingly valuable. Gradually houses were built upon it, various people bought it for investment, and it took on the look of other semi-developed suburban property. In the month of December 1905, over 17 years after the sinking of the Geyser, a lawyer named H. Huffman Brown offered to sell, at a bargain, to a young architect named Benjamin Levitan, 2 house lots adjacent to the southwest corner of 174th Street and Monroe Avenue, New York City. It so happened that Brown had, not long before, induced Levitan to go into another real estate deal, in which the architect's suspicions had been aroused by finding that the property alleged by the lawyer to be improved was in fact unbuilt upon. He had lost no money in the original transaction, but he determined that no such mistake would occur a second time, and he accordingly visited the property, and also had a search made of the title, which revealed the fact that Brown was not the record owner, as he had stated, but that on the contrary the land stood in the name of William R. Hubert. It should be borne in mind that both the parties to this proposed transaction were men well known in their own professions. Brown, particularly, was a real estate lawyer of some distinction, and an editor of what were known as the old New York Civil Procedure Reports. He was a middle-aged man, careful in his dress, particular in his speech, modest and quiet in his demeanor, by reputation a gentleman and a scholar, and had practised at the New York bar some 25 years. But Levitan, who had seen many wolves in sheep's clothing, and had something of the Sherlock Holmes in his composition, determined to seek the advice of the district attorney, and having done so, received instructions to go ahead and consummate the purchase of the property. He, therefore, informed Brown that he had learned that the latter was not the owner of record, to which Brown replied that was true, but that the property really did belong to him in fact, being recorded in Hubert's name merely as a matter of convenience, because Hubert was unmarried, and that moreover he, Brown, had an unrecorded deed from Hubert to himself which he would produce, or would introduce Hubert to Levitan and let him execute a deed direct. Levitan assented to the latter proposition, and the 14th of December, 1905, was fixed as the date for the delivery of the deeds and the payment for the property. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon of that day, Brown appeared at Levitan's office, where a detective was already in attendance, and stated that he had been unable to procure Mr. Hubert's personal presence, but had received from him deeds duly executed to the property. These he offered to Levitan. At this moment the detective stepped forward, took possession of the papers, and invited the lawyer to accompany him to the district attorney's office. To this Brown offered no opposition, and the party adjourned to the Criminal Courts Building, where Mr. John W. Hart, an assistant district attorney, accused him of having obtained money from Levitan by means of false pretenses as to the ownership of the property, and requested from him an explanation. Brown replied without hesitation that he could not understand why this charge should be made against him, that he had in fact received the deeds from Mr. Hubert only a short time before he had delivered them to Levitan, that Mr. Hubert was in New York, that he was the owner of the property, and that no fraud of any sort had been attempted or intended. Mr. Hart now examined the supposed deeds and found that the signatures to them, as well as the signatures to a certain affidavit of title, which set forth that William R. Hubert was a person of substance, had all been executed before a notary, Ella F. Brayman, on that very day. He therefore sent at once for Mrs. Brayman, who, upon her arrival, immediately and without hesitation positively identified the defendant, H. Huffman Brown, as the person who had executed the papers before her an hour or so before. The case on its face seemed clear enough. Brown had apparently deliberately forged William R. Hubert's name, and it did not even seem necessary that Mr. Hubert should be summoned as a witness, since the property was recorded in his name, and Brown himself had stated that Hubert was then actually in New York. But Brown indignantly protested his innocence. It was clear, he insisted, that Mrs. Brayman was mistaken, for why in the name of common sense should he, a lawyer of standing, desire to forge Hubert's name, particularly when he himself held an unrecorded deed of the same property, and could have executed a good conveyance to Levitan had the latter so desired? Such a performance would have been utterly without an object. But the lawyer was nervous, and his description of Hubert as a wealthy mine owner from the West, who owned a great deal of property in New York and had an office in the Flatiron Building, did not ring convincingly in Mr. Hart's ears. The assistant district attorney called up the janitor of the building in question on the telephone. But no such person had an office there. Brown, much flustered, said the janitor was either a fool or a liar. He had been at Hubert's office that very morning. He offered to go and find him in 20 minutes. But Mr. Hart thought that the lawyer had better make his explanation before a magistrate, and caused his arrest and commitment on a charge of forgery. Little did he suspect what an ingenious fraud was about to be unearthed. The days went by, and Brown stayed in the Tombs, unable to raise the heavy bail demanded, but no Hubert appeared. Meantime the writer, to whom the case had been sent for trial, ordered a complete search of the title to the property, and in a week or so became possessed, to his amazement, of a most extraordinary and complicated collection of facts. He discovered that the lot of land offered by Brown to Levitan, and standing in Hubert's name, was originally part of the property owned by Ebbe Petersen, the unfortunate Swede who, with his family, had perished in the geyser off Cape Sable in 1888. The title search showed that practically all of the Petersen property had been conveyed by Mary A. Petersen to a person named Ignatius F. X. O'Rourke by a deed which purported to have been executed on June 27, 1888, about 2 weeks before the Petersons sailed for Copenhagen, and which was signed with Mrs. Peterson's mark, but that this deed had not been recorded until July 3rd, 1899, 11 years after the loss of the geyser. The writer busied himself with finding someone who had known Mrs. Peterson, and by an odd coincidence discovered a woman living in the Bronx who had been an intimate friend and playmate of the little Peterson girl. This witness, who was but a child when the incident had occurred, clearly recalled the fact that Ebbe Peterson had not decided to take his wife and daughter with him on the voyage until a few days before they sailed. They had then invited her, the witness, now a Mrs. Cantwell, to go with them, but her mother had declined to allow her to do so. Mrs. Peterson, moreover, according to Mrs. Cantwell, was a woman of education, who wrote a particularly fine hand. Other papers were discovered executed at about the same time, signed by Mrs. Peterson with her full name. It seemed inconceivable that she should have signed any deed, much less one of so much importance, with her mark, and moreover that she should have executed any such deed at all when her husband was on the spot to convey his own property. But the strangest fact of all was that the attesting witness to this extraordinary instrument was H. Huffman Brown. It also appeared to have been recorded at his instance 11 years after its execution. In the meantime, however, that is to say, between the sinking of the geyser in '88 and the recording of Mary Peterson's supposed deed in '99, another equally mysterious deed to the same property had been filed. This document, executed and recorded in 1896, purported to convey part of the Peterson property to a man named John J. Kiley, and was signed by a person calling himself Charles A. Clark. By a later deed, executed and signed a few days later, John J. Kiley appeared to have conveyed the same property to Ignatius F. X. O'Rourke, the very person to whom Mrs. Peterson had apparently executed her deed in 1888. And H. Huffman Brown was the attesting witness to both these deeds. A glance at the following diagram will serve to clear up any confusion which may exist in the mind of the reader. 1888. Mary A. Peterson. By her mark, deed conveys to I. F. X. O'Rourke. Not recorded until 1899. 1896. Charles A. Clark conveys same property to John J. Kiley. 1896. John J. Kiley conveys to I. F. X. O'Rourke. O'Rourke thus holds land through two sources. Brown was the witness to both these parallel transactions. Of course it was simple enough to see what had occurred. In 1896 a mysterious man named Clark, without vestige of right or title so far as the records showed, had conveyed Ebbe Peterson's property to a man named Kiley, equally unsubstantial, who had passed it over to one O'Rourke. Then Brown had suddenly recorded Mrs. Peterson's deed, giving O'Rourke the very same property. Thus this O'Rourke, whoever he may have been, held all the Peterson property by two chains of title, one through Clark and Kiley, and the other through Mrs. Peterson. Then he had gone ahead and deeded it all away to various persons, through one of whom William R. Hubert had secured his title. But every deed on record which purported to pass any fraction of the Peterson property was witnessed by H. Huffman Brown, and Brown was the attesting witness to the deed under which Hubert purported to hold. Thus the chain of title, at the end of which Levitan found himself, ran back to Mary Peterson, with H. Huffman Brown peering behind the arras of every signature. Mary Peterson to O'Rourke. Clark to Kiley, attesting witness Brown. Kiley to O'Rourke, attesting witness Brown. O'Rourke to William P. Colleton, attesting witness Brown. William P. Colleton to John Garretson, attesting witness Brown. John Garretson to Herman Bolt, attesting witness Brown. Herman Bolt to Benjamin Freeman, attesting witness Brown. Benjamin Freeman to William R. Hubert, attesting witness Brown. The assistant district attorney rubbed his forehead and wondered who in thunder all these people were. Who, for example, to begin at the beginning, was Charles A. Clark, and why should he be deeding away Ebbe Peterson's property? And who were Kiley and O'Rourke, and all the rest, Colleton, Garretson, Bolt, and Freeman? And who, for that matter, was Hubert? A score of detectives were sent out to hunt up these elusive persons, but, although the directories of 20 years were searched, no Charles A. Clark, John J. Kiley, or I. F. X. O'Rourke could be discovered. Nor could any one named Colleton, Freeman, or Hubert be found. The only persons who did appear to exist were Garretson and Bolt. Quite by chance, the assistant district attorney located the former of these, who proved to be one of Brown's clients, and who stated that he had taken title to the property at the lawyer's request and as a favor to him, did not remember from whom he had received it, had paid nothing for it, received nothing for it, and had finally deeded it to Herman Bolt at the direction of Brown. Herman Bolt, an ex-judge of the municipal court, who had been removed for misconduct in office, admitted grumblingly that while at one time he had considered purchasing the property in question, he had never actually done so, that the deed from Garretson to himself had been recorded without his knowledge or his authority, that he had paid nothing for the property and had received nothing for it, and had, at the instruction of Brown, conveyed it to Benjamin Freeman. Garretson, apparently, had never seen Bolt, and Bolt had never seen Freeman, while William R. Hubert, the person to whom the record showed Freeman had transferred the property, remained an invisible figure, impossible to reduce to tangibility. Just what Brown had attempted to do, had done, was obvious. In some way, being a real estate lawyer, he had stumbled upon the fact that this valuable tract of land lay unclaimed. Accordingly, he had set about the easiest way to reduce it to possession. To make assurance doubly sure, he had forged 2 chains of title, one through an assumed heir and the other through the owner herself. Then he had juggled the title through a dozen or so grantees, and stood ready to dispose of the property to the highest bidder. There he stayed in the Tombs, demanding a trial and protesting his innocence, and asserting that if the district attorney would only look long enough he would find William R. Hubert. But an interesting question of law had cropped up to delay matters. Of course, if there was anybody by the name of Hubert who actually owned the property, and Brown had signed his name, conveying the same to a deed to Levitan, Brown was guilty of forgery in the first degree. But the evidence in the case pointed toward the conclusion that Brown himself was Hubert. If this was so, how could Brown be said to have forged the name of Hubert, when he had a perfect legal right to take the property under any name he chose to assume? This was incontestable. If your name be Richard Roe, you may purchase land and receive title thereto under the name of John Doe, and convey it under that name without violating the law. This, as a general proposition, is true so long as the taking of a fictitious name is for an honest purpose and not tainted with fraud. The assistant district attorney felt that the very strength of his case created, as it were, a sort of legal weakness, for the more evidence he should put in against Brown, the clearer it would become that Hubert was merely Brown himself, and this would necessitate additional proof that Brown had taken the property in the name of Hubert for purposes of fraud, which could only be established by going into the whole history of the property. Of course, if Brown were so foolish as to put in the defense that Hubert really existed, the case would be plain sailing. If, however, Brown was as astute as the district attorney believed him to be, he might boldly admit that there was no Hubert except himself, and that in taking title to the property and disposing thereof under that name, he was committing no violation of law for which he could be prosecuted. The case was moved for trial on the 12th of March, 1906, before Judge Warren W. Foster in Part 3 of the Court of General Sessions in New York. The defendant was arraigned at the bar without counsel, owing to the absence of his lawyer through sickness, and Mr. Louis Stuyvesant Chandler, the later Lieutenant Governor of the state, was assigned to defend him. At this juncture Brown arose and addressed the court. In the most deferential and conciliatory manner he urged that he was entitled to an adjournment until such time as he could produce William R. Hubert as a witness, stating that, although the latter had been in town on December 14th, and had personally given him the deeds in question, which he had handed to Levitan, Hubert's interests in the West had immediately called him from the city, and that he was then in Goldfields, Nevada, that since he had been in the Tombs, he, Brown, had been in correspondence with a gentleman by the name of Alfred Skeels, of the Teller House, Central City, Colorado, from whom he had received a letter within the week to the effect that Hubert had arranged to start immediately for New York, for the purpose of testifying as a witness for the defense. The prosecutor thereupon demanded the production of this letter from the alleged Skeels, and Brown was compelled to state that he had immediately destroyed it on its receipt. The prosecutor then argued that under those circumstances, and in view of the fact that the people's evidence showed conclusively that no such person as Hubert existed, there was no reason why the trial should not proceed then and there. The court thereupon ruled that the case should go on. A jury was procured after some difficulty. and the evidence of Mr. Levitan received, showing that Brown had represented Hubert to be a man of substance, and had produced an affidavit purported to be sworn to by Hubert to the same effect, with deeds alleged to have been signed by him. Mrs. Brayman then swore that upon the same day Brown had himself acknowledged these very deeds, and had sworn to the affidavit before her as a notary, under the name of William R. Hubert. Taken with the fact that Brown had in open court stated that Hubert was a living man, this made out a prima facie case. But, of course, the district attorney was unable to determine whether or not Brown would take the stand in his own behalf, or what his defense would be, and in order to make assurance doubly sure, offered in evidence all the deeds to the property in question, thereby establishing the fact that it was originally part of the Peterson estate, and disclosing the means whereby it had eventually been recorded in the name of Hubert. The prosecution then rested its case, and the burden shifted to the defense to explain how all these deeds, attested by Brown, came to be executed and recorded. It was indeed a difficult, if not impossible task, which the accused lawyer undertook when he went upon the stand. He again positively and vehemently denied that he had signed the name of Hubert to the deed which he had offered to Levitan, and persisted in the contention that Hubert was a real man who sooner or later would turn up. He admitted knowing the Peterson family in a casual way, and said he had done some business for them, but stated that he had not heard of their tragic death until some years after the sinking of the geyser. He had then ascertained that no one had appeared to lay claim to Mrs. Peterson's estate, and he had accordingly taken it upon himself to advertise for heirs. In due course Charles A. Clark had appeared, and had deeded the property to Kiley, who in turn had conveyed it to O'Rourke. Just who this mysterious O'Rourke was he could not explain, nor could he account in any satisfactory manner for the recording in 1899 of the deed signed with Mary Peterson's mark. He said that it had turned up in O'Rourke's hands after O'Rourke had become possessed of the property through the action of the heirs, and that he had no recollection of ever having seen it before, or of having witnessed it. In the latter transactions by which the property had been split up, he claimed to have acted only as attorney for the different grantors. He was unable to give the address or business of O'Rourke, Clark, Kiley, or Freeman, and admitted that he had never seen any of them save at his own office. He was equally vague as to Hubert, whose New York residence he gave as 111 Fifth Avenue. No such person, however, had ever been known at that address. Brown gave his testimony in the same dry, polite, and careful manner in which he had always been accustomed to discuss his cases and deliver his arguments. It seemed wholly impossible to believe that this respectable-looking person could be a dangerous character, yet the nature of his offence and the consequences of it were apparent when the State called to the stand an old broom-maker, who had bought from Brown one of the lots belonging to the Peterson estate. Holding up 3 stumps where fingers should have been, he cried out, choking with tears, "My friends, for 15 years I've worked at making brooms, me and my wife, from 5 in the morning until 6 at night, and I lose mine fingered trying to save enough money to buy a house that we could call our own. Then, when we saved $800, this man come to us and sold us a lot. We were very happy. Yesterday another man served me mit a paper that we must leave our house because we did not own the land. We must go away. Where? We have no place to go. Our home is being taken from us, and that man," pointing his stumps at Brown, "that man has stolen it from us." He stopped, unable to speak. The defendant's lawyer properly objected, but with this piece of testimony ringing in their ears, it is hardly surprising that the jury took but 5 minutes to convict Brown of forgery in the first degree. A few days later the judge sentenced him to 20 years in State's prison. Then other people began to wake up. The Attorney General guessed that the Peterson property had all escheated to the State. The Swedish government sent a deputy to make enquiries. The Norwegian government was sure that he was a Norwegian, and the Danish that he was a Dane. No one knows yet who is the real owner, and there are half a dozen heirs squatting on every corner of it. Things are much worse than before Brown tried to sell the ill-fated lot to Levitan, but a great many people who were careless before are careful now. It soon developed, however, that Lawyer Brown's industry and ingenuity had not been confined to the exploitation of the estate of Ebbe Peterson. Before the trial was well under way, the City Chamberlain of New York notified the District Attorney that a peculiar incident had occurred at his office, in which not only the defendant figured, but William R. Hubert, his familiar, as well. In the year 1904 a judgment had been entered in the Supreme Court, which adjudged that a certain George Wilson was entitled to a 1/6 interest in the estate of Jane Elizabeth Barker, recently deceased. George Wilson had last been heard of, 20 years before, as a farmhand in Illinois, and his whereabouts were at this time unknown. Suddenly, however, he had appeared. That is to say, H. Huffman Brown had appeared as his attorney, and demanded his share of the property, which had been deposited to his credit with the city chamberlain and amounted to $7,500. The lawyer had presented a petition signed apparently by Wilson, and a bond, also subscribed by him, to which had been appended the names of certain sureties. One of these was a William R. Hubert, the same William R. Hubert who had mysteriously disappeared when his presence was so vital to the happiness and liberty of his creator. But the city chamberlain had not been on his guard, and had paid over the $7,500 to Brown, without ever having seen the claimant or suspecting for an instant that all was not right. It was further discovered at the same time that Brown had made several other attempts to secure legacies remaining uncalled for in the city's treasury. In how many cases he had been successful will probably never be known, but it is unlikely that his criminal career dated only from the filing of the forged Peterson deed in 1896. Brown made a heroic and picturesque fight to secure a reversal of his conviction through all the state courts, and his briefs and arguments are monuments to his ingenuity and knowledge of the law. He alleged that his conviction was entirely due to a misguided enthusiasm on the part of the prosecutor, the present writer, whom he characterized as a novelist and dreamer. The whole case, he alleged, was constructed out of the latter's fanciful imagination, a cobweb of suspicion, accusation, and falsehood. Some day his friend Hubert would come out of the West, into which he had so unfortunately disappeared, and release an innocent man sentenced practically to death because the case had fallen into the hands of one whose sense of the dramatic was greater than his logic. Perchance he will. Mayhap, when H. Huffman Brown is the oldest inmate of Sing Sing, or even sooner, some gray-haired figure will appear at the state capitol and knock tremblingly at the door of the executive, asking for a pardon or a rehearing of the case, and claiming to be the only original, genuine William R. Hubert. Such a denouement would not be beyond the realms of possibility, but more likely the request will come in the form of a petition, duly attested and authenticated before some notary in the West, protesting against Brown's conviction and incarceration, and bearing the flowing signature of William R. Hubert, the same signature that appears on Brown's deeds to Levitan, the same that is affixed to the bond of George Wilson, the vanished farmhand, claimant to the estate of Jane Elizabeth Barker. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Chapter 9 of True Stories of Crime from the District Attorney's Office by Arthur Cheney Train. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Colleen McMahon. A Murder Conspiracy. William M. Rice, 84 years of age, died at the Berkshire Apartments at 500 Madison Avenue, New York City, at about half after 7 o'clock on the evening of Sunday, September 23, 1900. He had been ill for some time, but it was expected that he would recover. On or about the moment of his death, two elderly ladies, friends of the old gentleman, had called at the house with cakes and wine to see him. The elevator man rang the bell of Mr. Rice's apartment again and again, but could elicit no response, and the ladies, much disappointed, went away. While the bell was ringing, Charles F. Jones, the confidential valet of the aged man, was waiting, he says, in an adjoining room until a cone saturated with chloroform, which he had placed over the face of his sleeping master, should effect his death. Did Jones murder Rice? If so, was it, as he claims, at the instigation of Albert T. Patrick? These two questions, now settled in the affirmative forever, so far as criminal and civil litigation are concerned, have been the subject of private study and public argument for more than 7 years. Mr. Rice was a childless widower, living the life of a recluse, attended only by Jones, who was at once his secretary, valet, and general servant. No other person lived in the apartment, and few visitors ever called there. Patrick was a New York lawyer with little practice who had never met Mr. Rice, was employed as counsel in litigation hostile to him, yet in whose favor a will purporting to be signed by Rice, June 30th, 1900, turned up after the latter's death, by the terms of which Patrick came into the property, amounting to over $7 million, in place of a charitable institution named in an earlier will of 1896. It is now universally admitted that the alleged will of 1900 was a forgery, as well as 4 checks drawn to Patrick's order, 2 for $25,000 each, 1 for $65,000, and 1 for $135,000, which represented practically all of Rice's bank accounts. An order giving him control of the contents of Rice's safe deposit vaults, in which were more than $2,500,000 in securities, and also a general assignment by which he became the owner of Rice's entire estate. Thus, upon Rice's death, Patrick had every possible variety of document necessary to possess himself of the property. Jones took nothing under any of these fraudulent instruments. Hence, Patrick's motive in desiring the death of Rice is the foundation stone of the case against him. But that Patrick desired and would profit by Rice's death in no way tends to establish that Rice did not die a natural death. Patrick would profit equally, whether Rice died by foul means or natural, and the question as to whether murder was done must be determined from other evidence. This is only to be found in the confession of the valet Jones, and in the testimony of the medical experts who performed the autopsy. Jones, a self-confessed murderer, swears that upon the advice and under the direction of Patrick, though in the latter's absence, he killed his master by administering chloroform. There is no direct corroborative evidence save that of the experts. Upon Jones's testimony depended the question of Patrick's conviction or acquittal, and of itself this was not sufficient, for being that of an accomplice it must, under the New York law, be corroborated. In the confession of Jones, the State had sufficient direct evidence of the crime and of Patrick's connection with it, providing there was other evidence tending to connect Patrick with its commission. This corroborative evidence is largely supplied by the facts which show that for a long time Patrick conspired with Jones to steal the bulk of Mr. Rice's estate at his death. This evidence not only shows Patrick's possible motive for planning Mr. Rice's murder, but also tends to corroborate Jones' whole story of the conspiracy. Rice did not know Patrick, even by sight. He had heard of him only as a person retained by another lawyer, Holt, to do the dirty work in an action brought by Rice against Holt as executor to set aside Mrs. Rice's will, in which she assumed, under the community law of Texas, where Rice had formerly resided, to dispose of some $2,500,000 of Rice's property. If Rice was a resident of Texas, she had the legal right to do this, otherwise not. Holt employed Patrick to get evidence that Rice still was such a resident. Rice knew of this and hated Patrick. Patrick's connection with the Rice litigation had begun 4 years before the murder, which was not planned until August 1900. His first visit to Rice's apartment was made under the assumed name of Smith for the purpose of discovering whether the valet could be corrupted into furnishing fictitious proof of Rice's intent to reside in Texas. He flattered Jones, told him he was underpaid and not appreciated, and after a second visit, at which he disclosed his right name, persuaded him to typewrite a letter on Rice's stationery, addressed to Baker, Botts, Baker, and Lovett, Rice's attorneys, in which he should be made to say that he had lost hope of winning the suit against Holt, was really a citizen of Texas, and wanted to settle the litigation. Patrick said that he could arrange for the signing of such a letter, and was willing to pay Jones $250 for his help. Jones agreed. Patrick now learned that Rice was living with no companion except Jones, that he held little communication with the outside world, that the valet was in his confidence and thoroughly familiar with his papers, and that the will made in 1896 disinherited natural heirs in favor of an educational institution which he had founded in Texas. He also learned that while Mr. Rice was 84 years of age, he was in possession of all his faculties, conducted his own business, and might live for years. Possessed of these facts, Patrick's evil mind soon developed a conspiracy with Jones to secure the whole estate. Mr. Rice's pet charity was the William M. Rice Institute for the Advance of Science, Art, and Literature of Texas, which he had founded in 1891. He had donated to it more than $1.5 million. By the will of 1896, only small legacies were bequeathed to relatives, while the bulk of his fortune was left to the Institute. About a month after Patrick's first visit to the Berkshire Apartments, that is, in December 1899, while he and Jones were examining Rice's private papers, they stumbled upon the will. Patrick saw his opportunity. By the forgery of a new will, which would increase the legacies of those mentioned in the will of 1896, and leave legacies to every person who might have any claim upon the estate, it would be for the interest of those persons to sustain and carry into effect the forgery. The whole scheme was based upon the belief that every man has his price. He told Jones that he thought the will unjust, that he did not think it right to leave so little to relatives, and later he brought to Jones a rough draft of a will which could be substituted for the genuine one. Patrick was to get half the estate, the relatives were to receive double or 3 times the amount provided in the 1896 will, and what was left was to be given to the Rice Institute. He proposed that Jones should typewrite this will, and guaranteed to arrange for the witnessing and signing of it, and promised that Jones should get whatever he wanted. Jones at first objected, but was finally won over. Rewritten many times to include new ideas of the conspirators, the document finally reached the form of the will of June 30th, 1900, in which Patrick substituted himself for the Rice Institute and made himself one of the executors. An ingenious part of the conspiracy was the decision to leave the 1896 will in existence. If Patrick had destroyed it and the relatives had succeeded in overthrowing the will of 1900, the estate would have been left without testamentary disposition, and the relatives would have got more than was provided by either will. With the will of 1896 in existence, however, the relatives would get less if they overthrew the forgery. By retaining it, therefore, Patrick figured that the relatives would have selfish reasons for accepting the forgery as genuine. The preparation of this bogus will occupied about a month, and the next question was the procurement of witnesses. It was desirable to get the same persons who witnessed the former will. These were Walter H. Weatherby and W. F. Harmon, clerks for many years at Swenson's banking house. On the assumption that Weatherby had been injured by Rice and was therefore hostile to him, Jones practically unfolded the scheme. He told Weatherby that one of Mr. Rice's bonds had disappeared, and that Rice had accused Weatherby of stealing it. He wound up with the suggestion, "I will get one witness, and you can get another, and the thing is done." But Weatherby indignantly declined to join in the conspiracy. Morris Myers, who had been employed in Patrick's office, and David L. Short, a friend of both, were the false witnesses finally selected. They were clothed with the appearance of honesty and were brought into contact with Rice by Jones at various times, Myers as a notary public, and Short as Commissioner of Deeds for the State of Texas, an appointment procured for him by Patrick probably for this specific purpose. The date of the forged will, June 30th, 1900, was selected to correspond with the date of 3 genuine papers which Rice acknowledged before Short on that date. The next step was to obviate the absurdity of Patrick's being selected as the residuary legatee at a time when he was engaged in bitter litigation against Rice. The best way out was for Patrick to pose as a lawyer who had brought about a settlement of this expensive litigation, and thus won Rice's regard. Patrick first tried to accomplish this by getting friends to visit Rice and urge a settlement, but Rice rebuffed them all. Accordingly, Patrick again resorted to forgery, and in August 1900 manufactured an instrument of settlement dated March 6, 1900. But such an agreement would not explain the paradox of a man whom Rice hated and despised, and did not know by sight, turning up as the principal beneficiary under his will. It was necessary to manufacture evidence to be used after Rice's death in support of his claim of close relations. The idea of a personal meeting with Rice had been abandoned on Jones's advice, and Patrick therefore caused the valet to prepare 25 or 30 forged letters addressed to him and purporting to come from Rice. These referred to current business matters and conveyed the impression that it was Rice's custom to seek the lawyer's advice. One instructed Patrick as to the terms of the will of 1900. Carbon copies were made for filing in Rice's letter book after his death. To make assurance doubly sure and to secure immediate possession of Rice's securities, a general assignment to Patrick of all Rice's estate was forged, and an order giving him access to and possession of the securities on deposit in Rice's safety vault. But Patrick did not stop here. He procured from Jones 3 checks signed by Mr. Rice in the regular course of business, one payable to Jones for his July salary, and the other 2 for the July and August salary of an employee of Rice's in Texas named Cohn. These 3 checks Patrick kept as models, forwarding to Cohn 2 forged checks filled out by Jones upon which Rice's signature had been traced, and returning to Jones a substitute check with Rice's signature traced upon it. All 3 checks passed through the banks unsuspected. Traced signatures were also substituted for genuine ones upon letters dictated by Rice to his Texas correspondents. Thus Patrick secured the circulation of 5 copies of Rice's signature, which, if occasion demanded, he could produce as standards of comparison to correspond with his other forgeries. The principal preparations were complete, but title under the will might long be delayed and perhaps even eventually fail. Patrick was poor and in no condition to conduct adequately a serious litigation. The moment Mr. Rice died, a large amount of cash would be necessary. For the procurement of this, Patrick and Jones looked to the current balance of Rice's bank account, which amounted to some $250,000 on deposit at Swenson's private bank and at the Fifth Avenue Trust Company. With this they felt reasonably secure of success. For even if the will should be set aside as fraudulent, they had a second line of defense in the general assignment of the estate and the orders to Rice's $2,500,000 of securities. While the evidence affords a motive for Patrick to desire the death of Mr. Rice, it does not of itself, up to this point, indicate the slightest intention on the part of Patrick to do away with the old gentleman. It was therefore conceded by the prosecution that, upon Jones's own testimony, the conspiracy to murder was not formed until about 7 weeks before the event. The first evidence which points to an intent to murder is the famous cremation letter dated August 3rd. The cremation letter from Mr. Rice, authorizing Patrick to cremate his body, shows that Patrick intended to do away with Rice in such a way that an autopsy must, if possible, be prevented, and the evidence of murder destroyed. That Patrick forged such a letter was evidence that his connection with the murder was premeditated and deliberate. To cremate the body before an autopsy, it was necessary to procure a physician's certificate that Rice had died from natural causes. He therefore made preparation to secure such a certificate, and then, upon the strength of the cremation letter, to give directions for the immediate destruction of the body. Patrick, with the view of having at hand a physician who would be unsuspicious, and who would issue a certificate of death from natural causes, induced Jones to send for Dr. Curry, his own friend and physician, on an occasion when the valet was ill. This was in March, 1900. Dr. Curry came, and Jones, acting under Patrick's advice, cautioned him not to mention the lawyer's name to Rice. In course of time he saw Rice, gained his good opinion, and became his attending physician. But Rice did not die, and curiously enough it was he himself who suggested to Jones the instrumentality of death which was finally employed, for he read an article dealing with the dangers of chloroform as an anesthetic, and discussed it with the valet. This suggestion was conveyed to Patrick, who asked Dr. Curry whether chloroform left any traces discoverable upon an autopsy. Dr. Curry rather carelessly replied that it left but slight traces if administered only in quantities which would be fatal to a man with a weak heart. Patrick told Jones, so Jones alleges, to procure some chloroform, and this he did, sending to Texas for 2 bottles of 2 ounces each. From Dr. Curry's remarks it was manifest that a weakened condition of the patient was an important element, and as Jones was taking some mercury pills, prescribed for him by Dr. Curry, the valet induced his master to take some of them. The old gentleman was benefited, however, rather than weakened. This was before the forgery of the cremation letter. It was clear that larger doses of mercury would be necessary, and accordingly Patrick furnished Jones with pellets containing the drug in such quantities that Jones, experimenting with one of them, became ill. They had now the means to effect gradual death, but as mercury leaves traces discernible at an autopsy, it was decided that the body must be cremated promptly. Hence the cremation letter. It was hoped that Rice might drop off at any moment owing to his weakened condition, and in anticipation of death Patrick discontinued his visits to the apartment in order to establish a satisfactory alibi. Jones also frequently absented himself from the apartment in the evenings after the old man had fallen asleep. On September 16th Rice had an attack of acute indigestion, which might have resulted seriously had it not been for the mercurial pills which promptly relieved him. The reader should observe that practically all of this testimony comes from Jones. There is no extraneous evidence that Patrick induced the giving of the mercury. Patrick, however, spread false rumors as to Rice's general health, and also as to his financial condition and intentions, namely that Rice was only worth $750,000, and that those who expected he was going to leave his money to the Institute were doomed to disappointment. But neither his statements about Rice's condition, nor his remarks as to the disposition and extent of his property, are inconsistent with a mere hope that he would die and thus leave Patrick free to enjoy the fruits of his forgeries. There now occurred, however, an event which may well have played a part in inducing Patrick to supplement forgery by murder. On Sunday, September 16th, the plant of the Merchants and Planters Oil Company of Houston, Texas, of which Rice owned 75% of the capital stock, was destroyed by fire. The company being without funds to rebuild, its directors telegraphed to Rice requesting him to advance the money. The amount needed was $250,000, and if Rice consented, all the available funds on deposit in the New York banks, upon which the conspirators relied to accomplish their object, would be exhausted. Jones endeavored to dissuade the old man from advancing the money, but without effect, and Rice sent a letter to Houston agreeing to supply $150,000 and more in installments of $25,000 each. This was on September 18th, after he had wired to the same effect on September 17th. Patrick and Jones suppressed a telegram that Rice would advance $250,000, and on September 19th the old man received word that the first draft, in conformity with his telegram of September 17th, had been drawn, and would arrive in New York on the 22nd. Jones says that on showing this to Patrick, the latter announced that Rice must be put out of the way as soon as possible. Accordingly, on September 20th and 21st, Jones administered larger doses of mercury than usual, which, while weakening and depressing him, failed to cause his end. Saturday, September 22nd, the draft was presented at Rice's apartment. The old man was not confined to his bed, but Jones told the bank messenger, after pretending to consult him, that Rice was too ill to attend to business that day, and to return on Monday. That night Jones and Patrick met, and it was agreed, according to Jones, that Rice must not be allowed to survive until Monday. They still hoped that he might die without any further act upon their part, but Jones was informed by Dr. Curry that although the old man seemed weak and under a great mental strain, he nevertheless thought that he would recover. This Curry also told to Patrick, the latter calling at the doctor's house at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. "You think Mr. Rice will be able to go down Monday morning?" Patrick asked. "You had better wait until Monday morning comes," replied Dr. Curry. "Do you think he will be able to go downtown next week?" persisted the lawyer. The doctor answered in the affirmative. That night Mr. Rice slept quietly until 8 o'clock Sunday morning. Dr. Curry called and found him in excellent condition, having eaten a hearty breakfast. His heart was a trifle weak, but it was sound. His organs were all working normally. He felt no pain. The doctor left without prescribing any medicine, stating that he would not return unless called, and expressing his opinion that the patient would recover. This was about 11 o'clock, and Jones immediately hastened to Patrick's house and reported the conversation. It was clear that Rice's death would not occur before Monday morning. He might live to pay over the $250,000, long enough to give further testimony in the Holt litigation, and thus expose the whole fraudulent scheme of pretended settlement and of friendly relations with the lawyer, and finally, perhaps, even to make a new will. The success of the conspiracy demanded that Rice should die that night. Did he die naturally? Was his death caused by any further act of the conspirators? Did Jones kill him by means of chloroform? Jones's story is that Patrick supplied him with some oxalic acid, which was to be mixed with powdered ammonia and diluted in water, on the theory that it was preferable to chloroform, since it would not require Jones's presence in the room at the moment of death. Jones said that he endeavored to administer the mixture to the old man, but that he refused to take it. Jones had already procured the chloroform from Texas, as has been stated, and had turned it over to Patrick. He says that afternoon he procured this from Patrick, who told him how to administer it. This was a few moments after 6 o'clock. Rice was sleeping soundly. The colored woman who did the housework was absent for the day, and the rooms were deserted. He saturated a sponge with chloroform, constructed a cone out of a towel, placed the sponge in the cone, put the cone over the sleeping man's face, and ran out of the room and waited 30 minutes for the chloroform to complete the work. Waiting in the next room, he heard the doorbell ring and ring again, but he paid no attention to the summons. In point of fact, he was never quite sure himself whether the bell was not the creation of his own overwrought brain. At the end of half an hour he returned to the bedroom, removed the cone from Rice's face, and saw that he was dead. Then, after burning the sponge and the towel in the kitchen range, he opened the windows, straightened the rooms out, called the elevator man, asked him to send for Dr. Carey, and telephoned to Patrick that Rice was dead. Jones had no sooner telephoned Patrick that Rice was dead than the lawyer hastened to Dr. Carey's, and within 40 minutes appeared with him in Rice's apartments, assuming complete charge. Summoning an undertaker and having the cremation letter at hand, he gave orders for speedy cremation. But he now discovered the principal mistake in his calculations. He had omitted to investigate the length of time required to heat the crematory. This he now discovered to his horror to be 24 hours. But the body must be destroyed. The undertaker suggested that the body might be embalmed while the crematory was being heated, and Patrick at once seized upon the suggestion and gave orders to that effect, although the cremation letter sets forth specifically that one of the reasons why Rice desired cremation was his horror of being embalmed. The body was embalmed at the apartments that night, Dr. Carey innocently supplying the certificate of death from old age and weak heart, and as immediate cause indigestion followed by colocradal diarrhea with mental worry. Having arranged for the cremation at the earliest possible moment, Jones and Patrick rifled the trunk in which Rice kept his papers, and stuffed them in a satchel which Patrick bore away with him. The funeral was to be held early Tuesday morning, and the ashes conveyed by Jones to Milwaukee to be interred near the body of Rice's wife, while the relatives should not be notified until it should be too late for them to reach New York. The next step was to secure the $250,000 which Rice had on deposit. Patrick had already forged Rice's name to blank checks on Swenson and the Fifth Avenue Trust Company. Early Monday morning, Jones, with Patrick looking over his shoulder and directing him, filled out the body of the checks, which covered all but $10,000 of Rice's deposits. These consisted of one for $25,000 and one for $65,000 on Swenson, one for $25,000 and another for $135,000 on the Trust Company. They were all made payable to the order of Patrick and dated September 22nd, the day before Rice's death. One of the drafts on the Fifth Avenue Trust Company was cashed for him by a friend named Potts early Monday morning, and was paid without suspicion. But now came the second error, which resulted in the exposure of the conspiracy and conviction for murder. Jones, in filling out the $25,000 check on Swenson, had in his nervousness omitted the L from Patrick's Christian name, so that the check read Albert T. Patrick, and Patrick, in his excitement, had failed to notice the omission or attempt to obviate it by extra endorsement. This $25,000 Swenson check was entrusted to David L. Short for presentation to Swenson & Sons for certification. When he presented it, Wallace, the clerk, recognized Jones's handwriting in the body of it and thought the signature looked unnatural. He took it to a rear office, where he showed it to Weatherby, who was the person whom Jones had approached 9 months before with a request that he join the conspiracy to manufacture a bogus will. Weatherby compared the signature on the check with genuine signatures in the bank, and returned it to Short without any intimation that he regarded it as irregular, but assigning as the reason the defect in the endorsement. Short thereupon returned the check to Patrick, who supplied the necessary supplementary endorsement, and telephoned to Jones what had occurred, instructing him to say that the check was all right, in case the Swensons should inquire. Half an hour later Short returned to Swenson's, where the check was examined by one of the firm. Rice's apartments were then called up, and Jones said that the checks were all right. But this did not satisfy Mr. Swenson, so he instructed Wallace to call up the apartment again and insist on talking to Mr. Rice. Jones delayed replying to Wallace, and in the afternoon called up Patrick on the telephone, inquiring what he should say. Patrick replied that he would have to say that Rice was dead, and in accordance with this, Jones informed Swenson that Rice had died at 8 o'clock the previous evening. It was thus clear to Swenson that although the maker of the check was dead, Patrick, a lawyer, cognizant of that fact, was seeking to secure payment upon it, for Jones had told Swenson that he had reported Rice's death to the doctor and to Rice's lawyer, Patrick. Patrick, accompanied by Potts, went immediately to the bank, where Swenson informed him that the check could be paid only to the administrator. Patrick replied that there would be no administrator, that Rice had left no property in this state, and informed Swenson that he had an assignment by Rice to himself of all Rice's securities with Swenson. He also invited Swenson to the funeral. Later in the day, Patrick attempted to obtain possession of Rice's securities in the Safety Deposit Company and in the Fifth Avenue Trust Company by presenting forged instruments of transfer and the orders heretofore referred to, but after some delay the trust companies declined him access. The conspiracy had begun to go to pieces. The two mistakes and the failure to secure funds placed Patrick in a dangerous position. 2 o'clock on Monday afternoon, 18 hours after the death, Jones, at Patrick's direction, began to notify the relatives that Rice had died the evening before, and that the funeral would take place the following morning. The telegrams to Baker and to Rice, Jr. in Texas were in the following extraordinary form. Mr. Rice died 8 o'clock last night under care of physicians. Death certificate, old age, weak heart, delirium. Left instructions to be interred in Milwaukee with wife. Funeral 10 a.m. tomorrow at 500 Madison Avenue. It is significant that care was used to convey the information that the death was a natural one with a physician in attendance, that the body was to be interred in Milwaukee without reference to the cremation. This may well have been so that if any suspicions of foul play should arise, the recipients, realizing that they could not reach New York in time to arrest matters there, might hasten to Milwaukee to intercept the body, where they could be met by Jones with the cremation letter in his pocket and his urn of ashes under his arm. But the telegram did arouse suspicion, and Baker and Rice immediately wired Jones as follows: "Please make no disposition of Rice's remains until we arrive. We leave tonight, arrive New York Thursday morning." Baker also instructed N.A. Meldrum, a Texan then in New York, to cooperate with Jones in preserving everything intact. In the meantime, however, Swenson had notified his attorneys, who in turn had informed the police and the district attorney's office, and that evening at about 11 o'clock James W. Gerard, accompanied by a detective who posed as the lawyer's clerk, interviewed Patrick at his home. Patrick informed Gerard that he had an assignment of all Rice's property, and also a will of Rice's of which he was the executor. This was the first reference to the will of 1900. He also informed Gerard that he would not receive a cent under its provision. To have explained the real terms of the will would, under the circumstances, have excited too much suspicion. Yet he was eager to let the Swensons know that as executor he was in a position to control the profitable banking business that would arise from the settlement of the estate. In the meantime, 4 headquarters detectives, representing themselves as lawyers, visited the apartments. Patrick hurried to 500 Madison Avenue, where he learned of Meldrum's presence in town. Things were turning out far from the way in which he had expected. He then hastened to his office downtown, which he reached about 1:30 in the morning, and, alone, destroyed great quantities of paper, attempting to dispose of them through the toilet bowl, which was so clogged that the water flowed out upon the floor, necessitating an apology to the janitor. In the silence of the night misgivings came upon him. He lost his nerve, and at 2 o'clock in the morning called up the undertaker and revoked the signed order for cremation which he had given. Leaving the office at about 5 in the morning, he first visited Myers, thence proceeded to his own boarding house, and from there went to the apartments, which he reached at 8 o'clock. Here he found the detectives, who had been on guard since early morning to forestall any attempt to remove the body. At the funeral itself he attempted to conciliate adverse interests and to win witnesses for his purpose. He had begun to do this the very night that Rice had died, when he told the elevator man that he was remembered in Rice's will. He had also informed Weatherby that he had a $5,000 legacy. At the funeral were Blinn, one of Rice's nephews, who had come on from Massachusetts, and 2 ladies, to each of whom he stated that they had legacies which would soon be available, provided there was no contest of the will. The detectives now informed Patrick that he was wanted at headquarters, and Patrick invited Potts to accompany him, informing the latter that the police suspected that there was something unnatural in the cause of death, but that he could explain satisfactorily. As a matter of fact, no such intimation had been made to him by the police or anyone else. At police headquarters, after an interview with Inspector McCluskey, he was permitted to go his way. Patrick returned to Rice's apartments, sent for Short and Myers, and conferred with them there. He took this occasion to tell Maria Scott, the colored woman who worked in the apartment, that she was suspected of having poisoned Rice, and that she had better say nothing about his death. Jones told her that she was remembered in the will, and that it would be worth her while to stand by himself and Patrick, who would see that she was taken care of. Meanwhile, the coroner had sent the body to the morgue for autopsy. The autopsy was performed on Tuesday, 43 hours after death occurred, by Dr. Donlin, a coroner's physician, in the presence of Dr. Williams, also a coroner's physician, and of Professor R.A. Whithouse, an expert chemist. The 2 physicians testified at the trial that the organs of the body, except the lungs, were normal in condition, save as affected by the embalming fluid. They and Professor Whithouse agreed in their testimony that the lungs were congested. Dr. Donlin spoke of their being congested all over, while Dr. Williams characterized it as an intense congestion of the lungs, coextensive with them. Outside of the lungs, they found no evidence of disease to account for death, and beyond the congestion, these showed nothing except a small patch of consolidated tissue, about the size of a 25-cent piece. They testified, in effect, that nothing save the inhalation of some gaseous irritant could have produced such a general congestion, and that the patch of tissue referred to was insufficient to account for the amount of congestion present. Dr. Donlin could not testify what the proximate cause of death was, but was firm in his opinion that no cause for it was observable in the other vital organs. In this Dr. Williams concurred. He was of the opinion that chloroform would act as an irritant upon the lungs, and cause precisely that general congestion observable in the case of the deceased. Professor Whithouse testified that his analysis revealed the presence of mercury, obtained as calomel, and while the amount was not sufficient to cause death, its presence indicated that a larger quantity had existed in life. The embalming fluid had contained no mercury, and he and Dr. Donlin agreed that the embalming fluid would have no effect upon the lungs beyond a tendency to bleach them. In other words, the people's evidence was to the effect that no cause of death was observable from a medical examination of the body, save the congestion stated to exist in the lungs, and that this might have been caused by chloroform. Thursday morning Mr. Baker and F.A. Rice, the brother of the deceased, arrived in New York. Patrick showed them the cremation letter, and, inasmuch as they took a neutral position in the matter, ordered the cremation to proceed, and accordingly it took place that very day. He also endeavored to win the confidence of Baker, but succeeded in accomplishing little. He finally gave the latter a copy of the 1900 will and the original will of 1896. He also informed Baker that he had taken a large number of papers from Rice's apartments, and turned over to him a considerable number of them. He also surrendered on Friday the 2 Swenson checks. After considerable discussion, Baker told Patrick flatly that he would never consent to the probate of the 1900 will, that he was satisfied that the '96 will was the last will of Rice, and that he would insist upon its being probated. To which Patrick replied that so far as he was concerned, he did not know but that the probate of the '96 will would suit him just as well as the probate of the 1900 will, that it was a matter of indifference to him, and that so far as the Rice Institute was concerned, he was prepared to give Baker from $3 to $5 million for it, or any other sum Baker might name. These negotiations and conferences continued until the 4th of October, Patrick yielding step by step until he had divested himself of all control of the documents and securities. Meantime, sufficient evidence having been secured, Patrick and Jones were arrested on a charge of forgery and held for the grand jury. Bail was fixed at $10,000 each, but was not forthcoming. On October 21st, Mr. House, Patrick's lawyer, visited Patrick and Jones in the Tombs. Jones says that after Patrick had talked to Mr. House, the former called Jones to one corner of the room and told him that House insisted on knowing definitely whether a crime had been committed, and directed Jones to tell House that a murder had been committed, but that he, Patrick, was not concerned in it. This Jones declined to do without implicating Patrick. The two prisoners then returned to House, and Jones says that he informed House that he had killed Rice by chloroform, and gave him the same story which he told on the witness stand. After this, Jones apparently lost his nerve and told Patrick that he intended to commit suicide. This idea Patrick encouraged, agreeing that they should both do it at about the same time. On the 26th of October, Jones made a statement to Assistant District Attorney Osborne, which was in large part false, and in which he endeavored to exonerate himself entirely from complicity in any of the crimes, and in which he charged the actual administration of the chloroform to Patrick. 4 days later, Osborne sent for him and told him he had lied, upon which Jones became confused, continued to persist in some of his statements, qualified others, and withdrew still others. He was completely unnerved, and that night attempted, by means of a knife which Patrick had supplied him, to cut his throat. The attempt was a failure, and he was removed to Bellevue Hospital, where he remained until November 12th. He then finally gave the statement which corresponded with his testimony upon the trial, and which jibed with all the circumstances and evidence known to the district attorney. Did Patrick conspire with Jones to murder Rice? What corroboration is there of Jones's story that he killed Rice under Patrick's direction? First, what proof is there that murder was committed? Roughly, that Jones so swore, that Rice died at the time alleged, that he did not die from disease, but that he died from a congestion of the lungs, which could have occurred only in the case of a living organism by the administration of some such irritant as chloroform, that someone therefore must have killed him, and that Jones alone had the opportunity. Second, what proof is there that Patrick directed the murder? Evidence of an elaborate conspiracy, as briefly heretofore set forth, which contemplated the death of Rice. Of course, Patrick wanted Rice to die. If Patrick was not implicated in the killing, what motive had Jones to commit the deed? Why did Rice die at the precise psychological moment which would enable Patrick to prevent $250,000 on deposit being diverted to Texas? And finally, why did Patrick prepare a forged cremation letter for the destruction of the body? If the conspiracy contemplated a natural death, nothing could be of greater value to the two parties concerned than the means of proving that the death was not unnatural. This, in the most abbreviated form, is the case against Patrick. Space forbids any reference to his elaborate and ingenious defense, which was based entirely on an alleged complete failure of corroboration of Jones's testimony. Starting with the premise that the word of a self-confessed murderer and thrice perjured scoundrel was valueless as proof, he contended that there was no adequate evidence that Rice's death was felonious, and that the congestion of the lungs could have been and was caused by the embalming fluid, and was only attributed to the chloroform after Jones had given his final version of how the murder was accomplished. Technically, the case against Patrick was not a strong one. Dramatically, it was overwhelming. His own failure to testify, and his refusal to allow his lawyer, Mr. House, to relate what passed between them in the Tombs, remain significant, although not evidence proper for a jury to consider. Wherever lawyers shall get together, There the Patrick case will be discussed with its strong points and its weak ones, its technicalities and its tactics, and the ethics of the liberation of Jones, the actual murderer, now long since vanished into the obscurity from which he came. On the one hand stands a public convinced of Patrick's guilt, and on the other the convicted lifer pointing a lean finger at the valet Jones and stubbornly repeating, "I am innocent." Footnote: In 1906 the Governor of New York commuted the death sentence of Albert T. Patrick to life imprisonment, and the most extraordinary struggle in the legal history of the state on the part of a convicted murderer for his own life came to an end. The defendant in the death house at Sing Sing had invoked every expedient to escape punishment, and by the use of his knowledge had even saved a fellow prisoner, Mike Brush, from the electric chair. End of footnote. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Chapter 10 of True Stories of Crime from the District Attorney's Office by Arthur Cheney Train. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Colleen McMahon. A Flight into Texas. The flight and extradition of Charles F. Dodge unquestionably involved one of the most extraordinary battles with justice in the history of the criminal law. The funds at the disposal of those who were interested in procuring the prisoner's escape were unlimited in extent, and the arch-conspirator for whose safety Dodge was spirited away was so influential in political and criminal circles that he was all but successful in defying the prosecutor of New York County, even supported as the latter was by the military and judicial arm of the United States government. For at the time that Dodge made his escape, a whisper from Hummel was enough to make the dry bones of many a powerful and ostensibly respectable official rattle, and the tongue cleave to the roof of his mouth in terror. Who could accomplish that in which the law was powerless? Hummel. Who could drive to the uttermost ends of the earth persons against whom not a shadow of suspicion had previously rested? Hummel. Who dictated to the chiefs of police of foreign cities what they should or should not do in certain cases, and who could, at the beckoning of his little finger, summon to his dungeon-like offices in the New York Life Building, whither his firm had removed from Centre Street, the most prominent of lawyers, the most eminent of citizens? Surely none but Hummel. And now Hummel was fighting for his own life. The only man that stood between him and the iron bars of Blackwell's Island was Charles F. Dodge, the man whom he had patted on the knee in his office and called a mascot, when quite in the nature of business he needed a little perjury to assist a wealthy client. Hummel in terror called into play every resource upon which, during 40 years of practice, his tiny tentacles had fastened. Who shall say that while he made a show of enjoying himself nightly with his accustomed light-heartedness in the Tenderloin, he did not feel confident that in the end this peril would disappear like the others which had from time to time threatened him during his criminal career. But Hummel was fully aware of the tenacity of the man who had resolved to rid New York of his malign influence. His nemesis was following him. In his dreams, if he ever dreamed, it probably took the shape of the square-shouldered district attorney, in the shadow of whose office building the little shyster practiced his profession. Had he been told that this nemesis was in reality a jovial little man with a round, ruddy face and twinkling blue eyes, he would have laughed as heartily as it was in his power to laugh. Yet such was the fact. A little man who looked less like a detective than a commercial traveler selling St. Peter's oil or some other cheerful concoction, with manners as gentle and a voice as soft as a spring zephyr, who always took off his hat when he came into a business office, seemingly bashful to the point of self-effacement, was the one who snatched Charles F. Dodge from the borders of Mexico and held him in an iron grip when every influence upon which Hummel could call for aid, from crooked police officials, corrupt judges, and a gang of cutthroats under the guise of a sheriff's posse, were fighting for his release. Jesse Blocker is not employed in New York County, and for business reasons he does not wish his present address known. When he comes to New York, he occasionally drops into the writer's office for a cigar and a friendly chat about old times. And as he sits there and talks so modestly and with such quiet humor about his adventures with the Texas Rangers among the cactus-studded plains of the Lone Star State, It is hard even for one who knows the truth to realize that this man is one of the greatest of detectives, or rather one of the most capable, resourceful, adroit, and quick-witted knights of adventure who ever set forth upon a seemingly impossible errand. It is unnecessary to state just how the district attorney discovered the existence of Jesse, as we knew him. It is enough to say that on Saturday morning, July 23, 1904, he was furnished with the proper credentials and given instructions to proceed at once to New Orleans, Louisiana, and locate, if it were humanly possible to do so, Charles F. Dodge, under indictment for perjury and potentially the chief witness against Abraham H. Hummel, on a charge of conspiracy. He was told briefly and to the point that, in spite of the official reports from the police headquarters of both New York City and New Orleans to the contrary, there was reason to believe that Dodge was living, although not registered, as a guest at the St. Charles Hotel in the latter city. A partial and inaccurate description of Dodge was given him, and he was warned to use extreme caution to prevent any knowledge of his mission from being made known. Once Dodge had been discovered, he was to keep him under surveillance and wire New York immediately. Accordingly, Jesse left the city upon the same day at 4:45 p.m., and arrived 2 days later at 9:15 on Monday morning at New Orleans, where he went directly to the St. Charles Hotel, registered, and was assigned to room number 547 on the 5th floor. Somewhere in the hotel Dodge was secreted. The question was how to find him. For an hour Jesse sat in the hotel foyer and meditatively watched the visitors come and go, but saw no sign of his quarry. Then he arose, put on his hat, and hunted out a stationery store, where for 2 cents he bought a bright red envelope. He then visited a ticket scalper's office, secured the owner's business card, and wrote a note on its back to Dodge offering him cheap transportation to any point that he might desire. Armed with this, he returned to the hotel, walked to the desk, glanced casually over a number of telegrams exposed in a rack, and when the clerk turned his back, placed the note, addressed to Charles F. Dodge, unobserved, upon the counter. The office was a busy one. Guests were constantly depositing their keys and receiving their mail, and even as Jesse stood there watching developments, the clerk turned round, found the note, and promptly placed it in box number 420. The very simple scheme had worked, and quite unconsciously the clerk had indicated the number of the room occupied by Dodge. Jesse lost no time in ascending to the 4th floor, viewed room number 420, returned to the desk, told the clerk that he was dissatisfied with the room assigned him, and requested that he be given either room number 421, 423, or 425, one of which he stated he had occupied on a previous visit. After some discussion, the clerk allotted him room number 423, which was almost directly opposite that occupied by Dodge, and the detective at once took up his task of watching for the fugitive to appear. Within the hour the door opened, and Dodge and a companion, who subsequently proved to be E.M. Bracken, alias Bradley, an agent employed by Howe and Hummel, left the room, went to the elevator, and descended to the dining room on the 2nd floor. Jesse watched until they were safely ensconced at breakfast, and then returned to the 4th floor, where he tipped the chambermaid, told her that he had left his key at the office, and induced her to unlock the door of room number 420, which she did under the supposition that Jesse was the person who had left the chamber in Dodge's company. The contents of the room convinced Jesse that he had found Dodge, for he discovered there 2 grips bearing Dodge's name, as well as several letters on the table addressed to him. The detective returned to the hall and had a little talk with the maid. "The old gentleman with you has been quite sick," she said. "How is he today?" "He is some better," answered Jesse. "Yes, he does look better today," she added, "but he surely was powerful sick yesterday. Why, he hasn't been out of his room before for 5 or 6 days." This statement was corroborated by Dodge's physical appearance, for he looked haggard and worn. Jesse was now confident that he had found Dodge, in spite of the reports of the New Orleans police to the contrary, and he was also reasonably sure that the fugitive was too sick to leave the hotel immediately. He therefore telegraphed his superiors that he had discovered Dodge, and that the latter was ill at the St. Charles Hotel. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesse received a wire from New York as follows: "New Orleans Police Department claims party not there. Left for Mexico 3 weeks ago. Ascertain correct destination and wire at once." Jesse at once replied, "No question as to identity and presence here at this time." He now took up the task of keeping his quarry under absolute surveillance day and night, which duty from that moment he continued for a period of nearly 10 months. During the remainder of the afternoon and throughout the night, Dodge and Bracken remained in room number 420, and during the evening were visited by several strangers, including a plainclothes officer from the New Orleans Police Headquarters. Little Hummel, dining in Longacre Square in the glare of Broadway, was pressing some invisible button that transmitted the power of his influence even to the police government of a city 2,000 miles away. The following day, January 26th, at about 8:40 in the morning, Dodge and Bracken descended to the lobby. Bracken departed from the hotel, leaving Dodge to pay the bill at the cashier's window, and Jesse heard him order a cab for the 11:30 a.m. Sunset Limited on the Southern Pacific Railroad, and direct that his baggage be removed from his room. Jesse did the same. In the meantime, Bracken returned, and promptly at 11 a.m. left for the railroad station in a cab with Dodge. Jesse followed in another. As the two passed through the gates, the detective caught a glimpse of Dodge's ticket, and saw that it had been issued by the Mexican National Railway. Retiring to the telegraph office in the station, he wired New York as follows: "Bird flying, Sunset Limited. Destination not known. I am with him." He then hastily purchased a ticket to Houston, Texas, and boarded the train. Dodge's companion had bidden him goodbye as the engine started, and Jesse's task now became that of ferreting out Dodge's destination. After some difficulty he managed to get a glimpse of the whole of the fugitive's ticket, and thus discovered that he was on his way to the City of Mexico via Eagle Pass, Texas, while from the Pullman conductor he learned that Dodge had secured sleeping car accommodation as far as San Antonio, Texas only. So far all was well. He knew Dodge, but Dodge did not know him, and later on in the afternoon he had the satisfaction of a long talk with his quarry in the observation car, where they amiably discussed together current events and argued politics with the same vehemence as if they had been commercial travelers thrown fortuitously into each other's company. Dodge, however, cleverly evaded any reference to his destination. When the train reached Morgan City, Louisiana at 3 p.m., which was the first stop, Jesse wired New York as follows: "On Sunset Limited with friend. He has transportation to the City of Mexico via Eagle Pass, where I am now journeying with him. Answer to Beaumont, Texas." Later in the afternoon he sent an additional message from Lafayette, Louisiana. "Have seen transportation of friend and am positive of destination." Dodge was occupying Section 3 of the sleeping car Capitola, and, as became an invalid, retired early. At Beaumont, Jesse failed to receive any reply to his various messages, and when the train arrived at Houston, no word came from New York until it was almost the time of departure. Waiting until practically the last moment, Jesse hurried through the gates of the Union Station at Houston and bought a ticket to San Antonio. As he was leaving the ticket window, Night Chief of Police John Howard and 2 officers came hurrying up, inquiring anxiously for Mr. Jesse. The reinforcements had arrived. Outside on the track, the Sunset Limited was just getting under way. The first frantic puffs were being vomited from the funnel. Inside, Dodge was sleeping peacefully in his berth. Jesse, accompanied by Chief Howard, hurried up to the conductor, who was about to swing onto the steps of the sleeper, and ordered him to hold the train till the fugitive could be removed. After some argument, the conductor grumblingly complied, and Dodge was aroused from pleasant dreams of the Creole Quarter to the cold reality of being dragged out of bed by a policeman. He was unceremoniously hustled out of the sleeping car into a carriage, and taken to headquarters, where he admitted his identity and remarked, "I know what I am wanted for, but I will never return to New York." In his grip was found the sum of $1,563.15, as well as numerous letters from the law firm of Howe and Hummel, and a quantity of newspaper clippings relative to his case. Dodge pleaded with Chief Howard not to lock him up, urging that he was a sick man and offering a goodly sum if he might be taken to a hotel and guarded for the remainder of the night. But what went in New Orleans did not go in Houston, and the best that Dodge could get for himself was a cot in the ladies' detention room on the second floor of the jail. Early the following morning, Jesse visited police headquarters, and for the first time met George Ellis, Chief of Police of Houston, for whom he will always have a feeling of deep gratitude for his enthusiastic cooperation and loyalty in the many stirring events that followed. Dodge now received a telegram from New York, which was submitted to Jesse before reaching the prisoner, to the effect that Howe and Hummel were sending on an attorney to aid the fugitive in resisting extradition, and informing him that they had employed Messrs. Hunt and Myers as attorneys to look out for his welfare. These last immediately jumped in medias res, and on the afternoon of the same day secured a writ of habeas corpus from Norman J. Kittrell, District Judge of Harris County, Texas, returnable the following morning. The next day, January 28th, Kittrell released Dodge from custody. Jesse had anticipated this and immediately swore out another warrant, with the result that the prisoner was rearrested before he left the courtroom. Meantime, the Dodge interests retained another firm of lawyers, Messrs. Andrews and Ball, who on the following day secured a second writ of habeas corpus from Judge Ashe. The result of the first engagement thus being a draw, counsel on both sides agreed that this writ should not be returnable for 6 days. During this period, District Attorney Jerome employed Messrs. Baker Botts, Parker, and Garwood to represent him, and secured from Governor Odell at Albany a requisition on Governor Lanham of Texas for the extradition of the prisoner, which he entrusted to Detective Sergeant Herlihy of the New York Police. Herlihy reached Houston with the papers on the evening of January the 30th, and on the same train with him came Abraham Kaffenberg, a member of the law firm of Howe and Hummel, and a nephew of the latter. Likewise also came Bracken, still styling himself E.M. Bradley, and from now on Bracken was the inseparable companion, guide, philosopher, and friend of the unfortunate Dodge, whose continued existence upon this earth had become such a menace to the little lawyer in New York. Herlihy, accompanied by Judge Garwood, proceeded direct to Austin, where they found Dodge already represented by Messrs. Andrews and Ball, who, at the hearing before Governor Lanham, made a strong effort to induce that executive to refuse to honor the requisition of the Governor of New York. This effort failed, and Governor Lanham issued his warrant, but Herlihy had no sooner returned to Houston for the purpose of taking possession of the prisoner than he was served with an injunction enjoining him, together with Chief of Police Ellis, from taking Dodge into custody, pending a hearing upon a new habeas corpus, which had been issued by Judge Waller T. Burns of the United States District Court for the Southern District of Texas. This new writ was returnable February 9th. After exhaustive but futile argument by the counsel for Dodge, Judge Burns remanded the prisoner to Herlihy's custody to be returned to the state of New York, but this decision had no sooner been rendered than an appeal was taken therefrom by Dodge's lawyers, and the prisoner released upon bail fixed at $20,000. During this period, Dodge was quartered under guard at the Rice Hotel in Houston, and the day following the argument the $20,000 bail was put up in cash, and Dodge released from custody. In the meantime, however, Jesse, knowing that no sum, however large, would deter Hummel from spiriting Dodge out of the country, had made his arrangements to secure a new extradition warrant from the Governor of Texas, so that if the prisoner did succeed in getting beyond the Southern District of the Federal Court of Texas, he could be seized and conveyed to New York. Of course, someone had to keep watch over Dodge while Jesse hurried to Austin to see the governor, and it was decided to leave Sergeant Herlihy, reinforced by a number of local detectives, for that purpose. But while the watchful Jesse was away, Bracken proceeded to get busy in the good old Howe and Hummel fashion. Lots of people that Herlihy had never seen before turned up and protested that he was the finest fellow they had ever met. And as Herlihy was in fact a good fellow, he made them welcome and dined and wined at their expense until he woke up in the Menger Hotel in San Antonio and inquired where he was. Jesse, meantime, had returned from Austin to discover that Dodge, with his companions, Kaffenberg and Bracken, had slipped out of Houston early on the morning of February 11th, after disposing of Herlihy and eluding the watchfulness of Herlihy's assistants. Hummel was leading, and by 10 o'clock the next morning Dodge and his comrades were on board an English merchantman lying in the harbor of Galveston. Later in the same day, the Hummel interest chartered from the Southern Pacific Railroad for the sum of $3,000 the seagoing tug Hughes, to which Dodge was now transferred for the purpose of being conveyed to the port of Tampico in the Republic of Mexico. But here Hummel's wires became crossed with Jerome's, and unfortunately for the little lawyer, the persons from whom the tug had been leased turned out to be closely allied with the prosecution's interests, with the result that the captain of the tug was instructed by his superiors under no consideration to put into any Mexican port, but on the contrary to delay his departure from the harbor of Galveston for a period of 2 days, and then to proceed only as far as Brownsville, Texas, where he should compel the debarkation of the fugitive. The captain, who was a good sport as well as a good officer, promptly threw himself into the part, and told Bracken and Kaffenberg that it was evident from the barometer that a severe storm was approaching, which must have had a sinister implication to these two unfortunate gentlemen, and that he could not think of putting to sea. Once the storm had blown over, the tug started out across the blue waters of the Gulf of Mexico. But now Bracken and Kaffenberg were informed for the first time that it was impossible to consider putting into any port of the Republic of Mexico, since to do so would cause international complications and compel the revocation of the captain's license. In desperation, the Hummel interests offered the captain $5,000 in cash to disregard his instructions and put into Tampico, but the worthy sea dog was adamant. It was probably worth $5,000 to him to see 3 gentry of this pattern so much put about. While Dodge and his accomplices were dallying in the harbor of Galveston, Jesse was taking advantage of his opportunity to proceed at once by railroad to Alice, Texas, which at that time was the furthermost southern point reached by any railway in the direction of Brownsville. On his arrival, he at once applied to Captain John R. Hughes, commanding Company D of the Texas Rangers, who received him with great joy, and ordered a detachment of the Rangers to meet the tug at Point Isabella at the mouth of the Rio Grande River on the border of Mexico. In the meantime, Jesse started on a toilsome stage journey to Brownsville, across 170 miles of desert, which occupied 2 days and nights and necessitated his going without sleep for that period. During the trip Jesse heard no word of English, and had as his associates only Mexican cattlemen. Every 15 miles a fresh relay of broncos was hitched to the stage, and after a few moments' rest the misery began again. Jesse had been hurrying toward Brownsville by stage, while Dodge, Kaffenberg, and Bracken were landing at Point Isabella, where they were kept under close surveillance by Sergeant Tom Ross of the Rangers. Thence they took the train to Brownsville, registering at the Miller House under the assumed names of C.F. Dougherty, A. Kuntzman, and E.M. Barker, all of Oklahoma. But although they knew it not, Sergeant Tom was at their elbow, and had Dodge attempted to cross the border into Mexico, he would instantly have been placed under arrest. As Brownsville was within the Southern District of the Federal Court of Texas, Jesse decided not to arrest Dodge until he should actually attempt flight, and when Dodge and his companions on the following morning, February 15th, entered the stage, the same upon which Jesse had arrived, and started for Alice, Jesse and Tom Ross procured the best horses they could find and started after them, keeping just in sight of the stage. Dodge's intention in making this move was to take the Mexican International Railway at Alice and cross over to Mexico via Laredo. Jesse and Ross covered the 74 miles from Brownsville to Santa La Cruz Ranch by 4 in the afternoon, which was fairly strenuous work for a New York detective, and here found themselves so sore and exhausted from their ride that they were glad to hire a pair of horses and buggy with which to complete the journey to Alice. Luckily, they were able to get into telephonic communication with various ranch owners along the road, and arranged to have fresh relays of horses supplied to them every 20 miles. And here also Jesse called up Captain Hughes at Alice, and suggested that he substitute for the regular night clerk at the City Hotel one of the privates of the Rangers by the name of Herod. Dodge and his companions arrived in Alice on February 17th, and, as Jesse had anticipated, repaired at once to the City Hotel, where, inasmuch as they were dry from the dust of their trip and depressed by lack of society, they entered at once into an enthusiastic and confidential friendship with the man behind the counter in the hotel office, sublimely ignorant that they were unfolding to a member of the Texas Rangers all their most secret intentions. Herod was just as glad to see Dodge as Dodge apparently was to see Herod, and kindly offered to assist the fugitive to get into Mexico in any way the latter desired. Dodge, for his part, took advantage of his usefulness to the extent of requesting him to purchase them railroad tickets, the plan being to leave Alice the following morning for Monterrey, Mexico. 3 hours after the stage bearing Dodge and his party pulled up at the City Hotel, Tom Ross and Jesse drove in behind a pair of fagged-out Broncos at 2 in the morning. Jesse had had no sleep of any sort and no proper nourishment for 5 days, and had just strength enough left to drag himself up one flight of stairs and tumble into bed, from which he did not emerge for many hours. In the meantime, day broke, and Dodge, Kaffenberg, and Bracken, having breakfasted, drove comfortably down to the International Railway Station and settled themselves in the smoker. But they had no sooner given this direct evidence of their intention before Captain Hughes entered and placed Dodge under arrest. The latter's surprise may be appreciated when it is stated that from the time the three had left Houston, they had no idea that they were being followed, and believed that they had completely foiled Jesse and his assistants. While Jesse had been chasing Dodge across the desert, his lawyers had not been idle, and had secured at Austin another extradition warrant from Governor Lanham, who, on receiving news of the arrest, promptly instructed Captain Hughes by wire to assume charge of the prisoner and to deliver him into the hands of the New York officer to be conveyed to New York. There now began such a legal battle as the state of Texas had never known. Hummel had been forced into his last ditch and was fighting desperately for life. Through Kaffenberg he at once applied for a new writ of habeas corpus in Nueces County, and engaged counsel at Corpus Christi to assist in fighting for the release of the prisoner. Precisely as Hummel had intended, Chief Wright of Nueces rode into Alice and demanded the prisoner from Captain Hughes. As Hummel had not intended, Captain Hughes refused to surrender the prisoner and told Chief Wright to go to, well, he told him that he intended to obey his commander-in-chief, the governor of Texas. On February 20th, Hummel, through Kaffenberg, attempted to get another writ of habeas corpus in B County, and promptly the B chief came buzzing over and demanded Dodge, but to him Hughes replied even as he had spoken to Wright. Excitement in Alice had now reached such a pitch that Judge Burns of the federal court in Houston ordered United States Marshal John W. Vann of Alice to assume charge of the prisoner. The indomitable Hughes, however, paid no more attention to the United States Marshal than he had to the local chiefs. But the situation was so delicate, and the clash of authority might so easily have resulted in bloodshed, that it was finally agreed by all parties that the best thing to do was to have the prisoner returned to Houston in the joint custody of Captain Hughes of the Rangers and the United States Marshal. Jesse, through his counsel, in proper course, made application to forfeit Dodge's bond and remand him to jail, but the Hummel attorneys finally induced the court, on the plea that to confine Dodge in jail would be detrimental to his already badly impaired health, to permit the prisoner to go free on a greatly increased bond, nevertheless restricting his movements to Harris County, Texas. While Jesse had fought a winning battle up to this point, he was at the end of his resources so far as the extradition of the prisoner was concerned, for Dodge was now at liberty, pending the decisions upon the habeas corpus proceedings of the United States Circuit Court of Appeals at Fort Worth and the United States Supreme Court at Washington. But his orders were to bring Dodge back to New York. Hence, with the aid of some new men sent him from the north, he commenced an even closer surveillance of the prisoner than ever before by both day and night. Meantime, Kaffenberg departed for New York, fleeing from the wrath of Judge Burns, who had issued a summons for him for contempt of the federal court, on the ground that he had induced Dodge to attempt to jump his bond. In place of the blustering Kaffenberg was sent another member of the famous law firm of Howe and Hummel, David May, an entirely different type of man. May was as mild as a day in June, as urbane as Kaffenberg had been insolent. He fluttered into Houston like a white dove of peace with the proverbial olive branch in his mouth. From now on, the tactics employed by the representatives of Hummel were conciliatory in the extreme. Mr. May, however, did not long remain in Houston, as it was apparent that there was nothing to be done by either side pending the action of the courts, and in any event Dodge was abundantly supplied with local counsel. The time had now come when Hummel must have begun to feel that the fates were against him, and that a 20-year term in state prison was a concrete possibility, even for him. In the meantime, Dodge and Bracken had taken up their headquarters at the Rice Hotel, in the most expensive suite of rooms in the house, a new scheme for getting the prisoner beyond the reach of the New York courts apparently having been concocted. Dodge was now indulged in every conceivable luxury and vice. He was plunged into every sort of excess. There was no debauchery which Bracken could supply that was not his, and their rapid method of existence was soon the talk of the county, and continued to be so for 10 long months. There is more than one way to kill a cat, and more than one method of wiping out the only existing witness against a desperate man striving to escape the consequences of crime. Dodge's daily routine was somewhat as follows. He never slept at his own hotel, but arose in the morning between 10 and 11 o'clock, when he was at once visited by Bracken and supplied with numerous drinks in lieu of the breakfast for which he never had any desire. At noon the two would have luncheon with more drinks. In the afternoon they would retire to the pool rooms and play the races, and when the races were over they would then visit the faro banks and gamble until midnight or later. Later on they would proceed to another resort on Louisiana Street where Dodge really lived. Here his day may be said to have begun, and here he spent most of his money, frequently paying out as much as $50 a night for wine, and invariably ending in a beastly state of intoxication. It is quite probable that never in the history of debauchery has any one man ever been so indulged in excesses of every sort for the same period of time as Dodge was during the summer and fall of 1904. The fugitive never placed his foot on Mother Earth. If they were going only a block, Bracken called for a cab, and the two seemed to take a special delight in making Jesse, as Jerome's representative, spend as much money in cab hire as possible. The Houston Jehus never again experienced so profitable a time as they did during Dodge's wet season, and the life of dissipation was continued until from time to time the prisoner became so weak from its effects that he was forced to go under the care of a physician. A few days of abstinence always restored his vitality, and he would then start out upon another round of pleasure. During this period Jesse maintained a close and vigilant personal espionage over the prisoner. For over 10 months he slept less than 4 hours each day, his fatigue being increased by the constant apprehension of treachery among his own men, and the necessity of being ever on the alert to prevent some move on the part of the defense to spirit the prisoner away. During the summer attempts were repeatedly made to evade the vigilance of Jesse and his men, and several desperate dashes were frustrated by them, including one occasion when Bracken succeeded in rushing Dodge as far as Galveston, where they were forced to abandon their design. From time to time Bracken would disappear from Houston for a week or 10 days, stating on his return that he had been to New York, after which there was invariably some new move to get the prisoner away. Time and space prevent giving a detailed account of all the marches and countermarches that took place in this battle of wit against wit. In August 1904 Bracken made one of his periodical visits to New York, and when he returned sought out Jesse and said, "Blocker, you might as well be a good fellow and get yours while you can. I mean that Dodge is not going back to New York, even if it costs $1 million to prevent it." A few days later Bracken sent a gambler named Warner to Jesse, who offered the latter $3,500 to get lost long enough for the prisoner to slip over to Mexico. Acting upon the advice of his attorney, Jesse encouraged this attempt, under the belief that if he could get the Hummel forces in the position of having attempted to bribe him, the prisoner's bail could then be forfeited and Dodge himself taken into custody. Hummel became wary, however, and apparently abandoned for the time the idea of bribery. Later on Bracken again disappeared. On his return a marked change was noticeable in his demeanor, and Jesse observed that he was in constant consultation with Dodge, from which the detective drew the inference that some last desperate move was to be made towards the escape of the prisoner. On one occasion Jesse saw Bracken showing Dodge a map and some drawings on paper, which so excited his suspicions that he followed the two with unremitting assiduity. and within a day or two was rewarded, through Bracken's carelessness, with an opportunity for going through the latter's coat pockets in the billiard room. Here he found a complete set of plans, worked out in every detail, for spiriting the prisoner from San Antonio into Mexico during the state fair. These plans were very elaborate, every item having been planned out from the purchase of tickets and passing of baggage through the customs, to hotel accommodation in the city of Mexico and Tampico, and steamship tickets from Tampico to Europe. The plan had been to secure permission from the court for Dodge to leave Houston long enough ostensibly to attend the fair at San Antonio, and to lose him during the excitement and crowded condition of the city at that time. It is, of course, needless to say that these plans were abandoned when Bracken discovered that Jesse had been forewarned. Almost immediately thereafter, the Circuit Court of Appeals at Fort Worth, Texas, decided one of the habeas corpus cases adversely to Dodge, but it still permitted him to retain his liberty pending the final determination of the questions involved by the Supreme Court in Washington. The Hummel forces were apparently losing hope, however, for early in October another attempt was made to bribe Jesse. Bracken entered his room one evening and informed him that he could get his own price if he would only be a good fellow, and even went so far as to exhibit a quantity of money which he stated was $25,000. The only result of this offer was to lead Jesse to redouble his precautions, for he argued that the situation must indeed be acute when such an offer could be deemed worthwhile. Thereafter it was obvious that the revelry of Dodge and his companions was on the increase. Accordingly, Jesse added to his force of assistants. On December 2, 1904, Nathaniel Cohen, another member of the firm of Howe and Hummel, arrived at Houston, and the next day the Supreme Court at Washington decided the appeal in the habeas corpus against the prisoner, who was at once ordered by Judge Burns into the custody of United States Marshal William M. Hanson. Things looked black indeed for Dodge, and blacker still for Hummel. Howe, the little attorney, eating his midday lunch 4,000 miles away at Pontine's restaurant on Franklin Street, must have trembled in his patent leather boots. His last emissary, Cohen, at once procured an assistant by the name of Brookman, and with him proceeded to Wharton County, Texas, where they secured a new writ of habeas corpus, and induced the local sheriff, one Rich, to swear in a posse comitatus of 100 men, for the purpose of coming to Houston to take the prisoner by force of arms out of the hands of the United States Marshal. This was one of the most daring and desperate attempts made in recent years to frustrate the law. Jesse believes that the real object of this posse was to precipitate a fight between themselves and the federal authorities. It is not inconceivable that in such an event Dodge might either have escaped or been killed. The men composing the posse were of the most desperate character, and consisted largely of the so-called feud factions of Wharton County, known as the Woodpeckers and the Jaybirds. Jesse had been informed, on what he regards as reliable authority, that this move cost the Hummel forces $15,000, and that each member of the posse received $100 for his contemplated services in the rescue of the prisoner. But civil war, even on a small scale, cannot be indulged in without some inkling of the facts becoming known to the authorities, and prior to the receipt of the mandate of the Supreme Court, Judge Burns ordered the prisoner removed to Galveston for safekeeping. Thus the long, expensive, and arduous struggle came finally to an end, for Judge Burns in due course ordered that Charles F. Dodge should be conveyed to New York in the personal custody of the United States Marshal, and delivered by him to the New York authorities within the borders of that state. Such an order was, of course, exceedingly unusual, if not almost unheard of, but it was rendered absolutely necessary by the powerful influence and resources, as well as the unscrupulous character of those interested in securing Dodge's disappearance. In order to thwart any plans for releasing the prisoner by violence or otherwise, and to prevent the delay through the invoking of legal technicalities, Hanson and Jesse decided to convey Dodge to New York by water, and on the 16th of December the Marshal and his 5 deputies boarded a Mallory-Line steamer at Galveston, and arrived in New York with their prisoner on the evening of December 23rd. Dodge reached New York a physical wreck. How he was induced to tell the whole truth after he had pleaded guilty to the charge against him is a story in itself. A complete reaction from his dissipation now occurred, and for days his life was despaired of. Jessie, too, was, as the expression is, all in, and the only persons who were still able to appreciate the delights of New York were the stalwart Marshal and his boys, who for some time were objects of interest as they strolled along Broadway and drank deep and hearty in the cafes. To the assistants in the district attorney's office they were heroes and were treated as such. How Dodge finally testified against Hummel on the witness stand has already been told. As they say downtown, if Jerome had never done anything else, he would have made good by locking up Abe Hummel. No one ever believed he would do it, but Jerome never would have locked up Hummel without Jessie. And, as Jessie says with a laugh, leaning back in his chair and taking a long pull on his cigar, I guess I would not do it again. No, I would not do it again for all the money you could give me. The wonder is that I came out of it alive. When the reader comes to think about it, he will probably agree with him. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Chapter 11 of True Stories of Crime from the District Attorney's Office by Arthur Cheney Train. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Colleen McMahon. A Case of Circumstantial Evidence. In the town of Culiano, in the province of Solano in Italy, there dwelt a widow by the name of Torsielli with her two sons, Vito and Antonio. The boys loved their mother devotedly, and were no less fond of each other, the height of their ambition being to earn enough money to support her in comfort, without need of working in her old age. As it was, she arose before light, made the fire, cooked their breakfast, and labored in and about the house all day until they returned from the fields. But she was getting old, and at last became bedridden and infirm. She could no longer cook the meals, and the boys had to shift for themselves. Moreover, instead of finding her standing at the door with a smile on her wrinkled face, welcoming them to supper on their return, the fire was always out, and their mother lay on her couch, no less glad to see them, to be sure, but no longer able to amuse them or minister to their comfort. Then the taxes were increased, and hard times came. By twos and threes the men of the village packed their bundles, bade good-bye to their friends and families, and left the town, some to seek work in other parts of Italy, but most of them to take the big iron steamships for America, where work was easy and money plentiful. Sadly the boys watched their comrades depart. They would have liked to go, too, to seek their fortunes in this new land of promise, but they could not leave their mother. The following year some of the men who had gone away to America returned in fine clothes and with full purses to tell of the wonderful country beyond the seas, where one could always earn his 10 lire every day and do as he liked. "Viva la libertà!" they cried, pounding on the tables in the café. "Come, comrades, we have plenty of money. Drink to the great country of America." Vito and Antonio listened with envy. One evening the elder brother asked Antonio to come to walk with him. When they had gone a little way, he said suddenly, "Tony, I think I shall go to this America. We need more money to make our mother comfortable. If we wait until she is dead, the money will be of no use. You can stay here, and when I have made a place for you and her, you shall bring her on the ship to the new country." Vito was 5 years older than Antonio, and his word had always been law to the younger brother. So, although he was sick at heart at the thought of being left behind, he said nothing against the project, but tried to make it easy for Vito with their mother. The old woman could not bear the thought of her firstborn leaving her, and declared, with tears running down her face, that she should never see him again, but at last she yielded to their persuasions, and gave Vito her blessing. It would be only a little while before she and Tony would join him, and they would be happy ever after. Then Tony was left alone with his mother. Every day he arose at the first streak of dawn, prepared breakfast, cleaned the house, saw that his mother was comfortable, and then started off for the fields. A month went by, 2 months, 3, a year, but no word came from Vito. Tony assured the poor old woman that they would certainly hear from him the next week or the next, but cruel fear had taken possession of him. Something had happened to his brother. The years swept on. Their mother became more and more helpless. Antonio was obliged to hire a woman to care for her as a nurse for a small sum, but it was just enough to leave only a pittance for them to live on. Tony grew thin and haggard. Where could Vito be? Was he alive or dead? Next to his love for Nicoletta Lupero, it became the great passion of his life to learn what had become of Vito. He had known Nicoletta from a child, and their love had followed as naturally as summer follows spring. It had always been Tony and Nicoletta ever since he could remember. But she was growing up, and from a boy he had become a man. Yet how could he marry when he could hardly earn enough to support his mother and himself? They talked it over time and time again. If Vito would only return, or good times come, it might be possible. But meantime there was nothing to do but wait. Nicoletta blossomed into womanhood. Had she not been betrothed, she would have been called an old maid. Neither she nor Tony took any part in the village merrymakings. Why should they? He was 30 and she 25. They might have been married 10 years ago had not the elder brother gone away. Tony secretly feared that the time would never come when they would be man and wife, but he patiently labored on, earning his 2 lire, or at most 2 lire and a half, per day. Then a man returned from America just for the harvest to see his family. He said that Vito was alive. He had not seen him himself, but others had seen him, and he was rich. He told of the plentifulness of gold in America, where everyone was comfortable and could lay up a fortune. He himself had saved over 5,000 lire in 4 years, and owned a 1/3 interest in a fruit store. He was going to take his brother's family back with him, all of them. They would be rich, too, in a little while. A man was a fool to stay in Italy. Why did not Tony come back with him? He would get him a place on the railroad where one of his friends was padrone. Tony discussed it all with Nicoletta, and she talked with the man herself. "Tony," she said at length, "why do you not go? Here you are earning nothing. There you could save in a month enough to keep your mother in comfort for a year. You have to pay the nurse, and that takes a great deal. While you are here it would cause talk if I came to live in your home to care for your mother. But if you go away, I can do so without comment, and it will cost nothing. Perhaps you will find Vito. If not, you will soon make enough to send for both your mother and me." "You're a good girl," he answered, kissing her, "but I could not shift the responsibility of my mother to your shoulders. Still, I will talk to Father Giuseppe about it." The priest thought well of the plan. He was a little excited over America himself, and agreed to break the matter to the mother. She begged Tony piteously not to go. He was her only surviving son. Vito was dead. Let him but wait a little while, and she would not be there to stand in his way. Then the priest added his personal assurance that it would be for the best, and the mother finally gave way. Tony was obliged to tear himself away by force from the arms of the old woman lying upon the bed, and her feeble sobs echoed in his ears as he trudged down the road with the scarf Nicoletta had worked about his neck, and a small bundle of his tools and most precious possessions on his shoulder. A couple of miles farther on came another harrowing parting with his betrothed, and from the top of the next rise beyond he could see Nicoletta, still standing at the crossroads, gazing pitifully after him. Thus many an Italian, for good or ill, has left the place of his birth for the mysterious land of the Golden West. The voyage was for Antonio an unalloyed agony of seasickness and homesickness, and when at last the great vessel steamed slowly up the North River, her band playing and the emigrants crowding eagerly to her sides, he had hardly spirit enough left to raise his eyes to the mountains of huge buildings, from whose craters the white smoke rose slowly, and blew away in great wind-torn clouds. Yet he felt some of the awakening enthusiasm of his comrades, and when once his feet touched earth again, it was not long before he almost forgot his sufferings upon the ocean, in his feverish anxiety to lose no time in beginning to save the money which should reunite him to Nicoletta and his mother. As soon as the vessel had docked, a blustering Italian came among the emigrants and tagged a few dozen of them, including Antonio, with large blue labels, and then led them in a long, straggling line across the gangplank, and marched them through the muddy streets to the railroad train. Here they huddled in a dirty car filled with smoke, and were whirled with frightful speed for hours through a flat and smiling country. The noise, the smoke, and the unaccustomed motion made Antonio ill again, and when the train stopped at Lambertville, New Jersey, the padrone had difficulty in rousing him from the animal-like stupor into which he had fallen. The Italians crowded together upon the platform, gazing helplessly at one another and at the padrone, who was cursing them for a lot of stupid fools, and bidding them to get upon a flat car that stood upon a siding. Antonio had to be pushed upon it by main force, but the journey this time was short, and in half an hour he found himself upon an embankment, where hundreds of Italians were laboring with pick and shovel in the broiling sun. Here he was also given a pick and told to go to work. Tony soon became accustomed to his new surroundings. Every night he and the rest were carried to Lambertville on flat cars, and in the morning were brought back to the embankment. The work was no harder than that to which he had been used, and he soon became himself again. Moreover, he found many of his old friends from Culiano working there. In the evenings they walked through the streets of the town or sat under the trees playing mora and tocco. His letters home were quite enthusiastic regarding the pleasant character of the life. To be sure, he could not write himself, but his old friend Antonio Strollo, who had lived at Valva, only a mile from Culiano, acted as his amanuensis. He was very fond of Strollo, who was a dashing fellow, very merry, and quite the beau of the colony, in his wonderful red socks and neckties of many colors. Strollo could read and write, and besides he knew Antonio's mother and Nicoletta, and when Tony found himself unable to express his thoughts, Strollo helped him out. When the answers came he read them to Tony, and joined in the latter's pleasure. Tony himself soon became a favorite in Lambertville, for he was simple and gentle, and full of goodwill for everybody. He was very good looking, too, with his handsome Roman profile, snapping black eyes, and black curly locks. Yet he was sad always, especially so as since his arrival in America he had made no progress toward finding Vito. From time to time he met other Italians who had been working elsewhere, who thought they had seen him or someone that looked like him. But inquiry always elicited the fact that their desire to give him encouragement was greater than the accuracy of their memories. Of course, Antonio Strollo, who had become Tony's inseparable friend, shared all his eagerness to find Vito. In fact, Tony had no thought that he did not confide to his friend, and it was really the latter who composed the love letters to Nicoletta and the affectionate epistles to the mother. Every month Tony divided what he earned into 3 parts. One of them he deposited in the savings bank. Another he invested in a money order, which was sent by Strollo to Nicoletta for the mother, and the last he kept for himself. It was astounding how fast one really could make money if one was industrious. $40 a month sometimes. That made nearly 70 lire to send to Nicoletta. His bank account grew steadily, and he often saved something out of the money he allowed himself to live upon. Antonio Strollo, on the other hand, was lazy, and spent all his wages on Chianti, neckties, waistcoats, and gambling. Sometimes he would do nothing for a whole month but loiter around the streets smoking cigars and ogling the village girls. These last were afraid of him and called him the daredevil. Tony worked on the embankment for 3 years, sending his money with a letter to Nicoletta every month. The mother still lived, and Nicoletta was giving up her own life to take care of her, but the old woman was very feeble, and no longer had any hope of seeing either of her sons again. Moreover, she was now so bedridden that it was useless to think of trying to move her, even if Tony had plenty of money. No, as soon as he was satisfied that Vito could not be found, and had saved enough money, he must return. How she begged him to return! As Strollo read him the girl's letters, Tony wept bitter tears, and Strollo wept likewise in sympathy. But no word came of Vito. Tony, anxious about his mother, despairing of ever finding his brother, pining for Nicoletta, and with $300 lying in the savings bank, decided to return to Italy. But if only he could find Vito first. Then Antonio Strollo had an idea. Why not advertise, he suggested. He wondered that they had never thought of it before. They would put a notice in Il Progresso, the Italian paper in New York, and see what would come of it. Tony agreed that the idea was good, so Strollo wrote the notice offering a reward for news of Vito. 2 months passed. Once more Tony gave up hope, and then, oh never to be forgotten day, a letter came from the post office from Vito. Tony threw his arms about Strollo and kissed him for joy. Vito was found at last. The letter, dated Yonkers, New York, told how Vito had by chance heard of Tony's notice and learned that he was in America. He himself, he said, had prospered and was a padrone, employing many workmen on the waterworks. He begged Tony for news of their mother. He confessed himself an ungrateful son never to have written, but he had married and had had children, and had assumed that she was being cared for by his brother. Tony must forgive him, and come to him at once. "Oh, Dio!" cried Tony, the tears in his eyes. "Forgive him? Of course I will forgive him. Come, Antonio, let us write my dear brother a letter without delay, and tell him that our mother is still alive. How should I like to see his wife and babies!" So they prepared a long letter, which Strollo took to the post office himself and mailed. Tony went back to work with joy in his heart, and whistled and sang all day long, and of course he wrote all about it to Nicoletta. He was only waiting for his month to be up before starting. Then he would go to Yonkers, make Vito a little visit, and return home to Italy. It would be easy enough after that for Vito to send them money, if necessary, to live upon. Several letters passed between the brothers, and at the end of the month Tony drew out his money from the bank, received his wages in full, and prepared to leave Lambertville. Meanwhile a letter had come from Nicoletta, telling of his mother's joy at learning that Vito was still alive. As Tony had doubts as to his ability to find his way to Yonkers, Strollo kindly offered to accompany him. Tony had made many friends during his 3 years' stay in Lambertville, and he promised to write to them and tell them about Vito and his family. So it was agreed that the letter should be sent to Sabato Gizzi, in whose house he had lived, and that Gizzi should read it to the others. The address was written carefully on a piece of paper and given to Tony. So early in the morning of August 16th, 1903, Tony and Strollo took the train for New York. It was a hot day, and once again the motion and speed made Tony feel ill, but the thought of seeing Vito buoyed him up, and by the time they had crossed the ferry and had actually reached New York he was very hungry. In his excitement he had forgotten to eat any breakfast, and was now beginning to feel faint. But Strollo said it was a long way to Yonkers, and that they must not stop. For many hours they trudged the streets without getting anywhere, and then Strollo said it was time to take the cars. Tony was very tired, and he had to climb many flights of stairs to the train. It carried them a long distance, past miles of tenement houses and vacant lots, and at last into a sort of country. Strollo said they should get out. It was very hot, and Tony was weak from weariness and lack of food. But his heart was light, and he followed Strollo steadily down the wilting road. After going about a mile they crossed some fields near where people were playing a game at hitting little balls with sticks. It was astonishing how far they could strike the balls, entirely out of sight. "Is this Yonkers?" asked Tony. "It is near here," answered Strollo. "We're going by a short way." They entered some thick woods, and came out upon another field. Tony was now so faint that he begged his friend to stop. "Can we not get some food?" he inquired. "I can hardly walk." "There's a man in that field," said Strollo. "Go and ask him." So Tony plodded over to the man who was digging mushrooms, and asked him in broken English where they could get something to eat. The man told him that it was a long way. They would have to take the trolley to Yonkers. There was a restaurant there called the Promised Land, where one could get Italian dishes. He seemed to take a kindly interest in Tony and in Strollo, who had remained some distance behind, and Tony gave him a cigar, a Cremo, the last one he had. Then Strollo led the way back into the woods. It was almost sunset, and the long, low beams slanting through the tree trunks made it hard to see. They went deeper and deeper into the woods. Presently Strollo, who was leading the way, stopped and said, "We are going in the wrong direction. We must turn around and go back." Tony turned. As he did so, Strollo drew a long knife and plunged it again and again through Tony's body. Strollo spent that night under an assumed name at the Mills Hotel in Bleecker Street. He had stabbed himself accidentally in the knee, and also in the left hand, in the fury of his attack, and when he arose in the morning the sheets were covered with blood. There was also blood on his shoes, which had been new, but he took his knife and scraped it off. He had experienced a strange sort of terrified exultation the night before, and in the early light, as he crept downstairs and out of the hotel, he could not have told whether he were more glad or afraid, for he had $300 in his pocket, more than he had ever seen at any one time before, as much as a man could save in 2 whole years. He would be a king now for a long time. He need not work. He could eat, drink, and play cards, and read some books he had heard about. As for finding him out, never. The police would not even know who Torsielli was, to say nothing of who had killed him, for he had removed, as he thought, everything in Tony's pockets. There would be a dead man in the morgue, that was all. He could go back to Lambertville and say that he had left Tony with his brother at Yonkers, and that would be the end of it. First, though, he would buy some new clothes. It was very early, and the shops were hardly open, but he found one place where he could buy a suit, another some underclothes, and a third a pair of shoes. The shoemaker, who was a thrifty man, asked Strollo what was the matter with the shoes that he had on, so Strollo craftily said they hurt his feet. Then he ate a hearty breakfast and bought a better cigar than he had ever smoked before. There was a bookstore nearby, and he purchased some books, Alto Amore, and Sua Maestà e Sua Moneta, The Height of Love, and His Majesty and His Money. He would read them on the train. He felt warm and comfortable now, and not afraid at all. By and by he went back on the train to Lambertville and smoked and read all the way, contented as the tiger is contented, which has tracked down and slain a water buffalo. That same afternoon, about sunset, in a lonely part of Van Cortlandt Park, the mushroom digger stumbled over Torsielli's body lying face downward among the leaves. He recognized it as that of the man who had asked the way to something to eat and had given him a cigar. He ran from the sight, and pallid with fear, notified the nearest police officer. Then things took the usual course. The body was removed to the morgue, an autopsy was performed, and headquarters took charge of the case. As the deceased was an Italian, Detective Sergeant Petrosini was called in. Torsielli's pockets were empty, save for the band of a Cremo cigar in one waistcoat pocket and a tiny slip of paper in another, on which was penciled, Sabato Gizzi, P.O. Box 239, Lambertville, New Jersey. Whether this last was the name of the deceased, the murderer, or someone else, no one knew. Headquarters said it was a blind case, but Petrosini shrugged his shoulders and bought a ticket to Lambertville. Here he found Sabato Gizzi, who expressed genuine horror at learning of Tony's death, and readily accompanied Petrosini to New York, where he identified the body as indeed that of Torsielli. He told Petrosini that Tony had left Lambertville in the company of Strollo on Thursday, August 16th. This was Saturday, August 18th, and less than 36 hours after the murder. Strollo, reading Alto Amore and drinking in the saloon, suspected nothing. New York was 70 miles away, too far for any harm to come. But Monday morning, walking lazily down the street near the railroad station, Strollo found himself suddenly confronted by a heavily built man with a round, moon-shaped face thickly covered with pockmarks. Strollo did not like the way the latter's gimlet-like eyes looked him over. There was no time to turn and fly, and besides, Strollo had no fear. They might come and ask him questions, and he might even admit almost all, and they could do nothing, for no one had seen what he had done to Tony in the wood. So Strollo returned Petrosini's gaze unflinchingly. "Are you Antonio Strollo?" asked the detective, coming close to the murderer. "Yes, certainly I am Antonio Strollo," replied the latter. "Do you know Antonio Torsielli?" continued Petrosini. "To be sure," answered Strollo. "I knew him well," he added almost insolently. "Why did you accompany him to New York?" inquired Petrosini sharply. Strollo paled. He had not known that the police were aware of the fact. "I had errands in the city. I needed clothes," said Strollo. "He has been murdered," said Petrosini quietly. "Will you come to New York to identify the body?" Strollo hesitated. "Why, yes, certainly. I will go to New York." Then he added, thinking that his words seemed insufficient, "I'm sorry if Torsielli has been murdered, for he was a friend of mine." There was a wait of several hours before the train started for New York, and Strollo utilized it by giving Petrosini a detailed account of his trip with Torsielli. He took his time about it, and thought each statement over very carefully before he made it, for he was a clever fellow, this Strollo. He even went into the family history of Torsielli, and explained about the correspondence with the long-lost brother, in which he acted as amanuensis, for he had come to the conclusion that in the long run honesty up to a certain point would prove the best policy. Then he told the detective many things which the latter did not know, or even suspect. Strollo's account of what had happened was briefly as follows. He and Tony had reached New York about 12 o'clock, and had spent an hour or so in the neighborhood of Mott Street, looking at the parade of San Rocco. Then they had started for Yonkers, and gone as far as the terminal of the 2nd Avenue L. It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. They had got out and started to walk. As they proceeded, they suddenly had seen a man standing under a tree, and Torsielli had said to Strollo, "That man standing under that tree looks like my brother." Strollo had replied, "You know, I am not acquainted with your brother." As they reached the tree, the stranger had stepped forward and said to Torsielli, "Who are you?" "Who, me? My name is Antonio Torsielli," had been the reply. "Who are you?" "I am Vito Torsielli," had answered the stranger. Then the two had rushed into each other's arms. "And what did you do?" inquired Petrosini, as Strollo naively concluded this extraordinary story. "Me?" answered Strollo innocently. "Why, there was nothing for me to do, so I went back to New York." Petrosini said nothing, but bided his time. He had now several important bits of evidence. By Strollo's own account, he had been with the deceased in the general locality of the murder shortly before it occurred. He had given no adequate explanation of why he was in New York at all, and he was now fabricating a preposterous falsehood to show that he had left his victim before the homicide was committed. On the train, Petrosini began to tie up some of the loose ends. He noticed the wound on Strollo's hand and asked where it had been obtained. The suspect replied that he had received it at the hands of a drunken man in Mott Street. He even admitted having stayed at the Mills Hotel the same evening under an assumed name, and gave as an excuse that his own name was difficult for an American to pronounce and write. Later this information led to the finding of the bloody bedclothes. He denied, however, having changed his clothes or purchased new ones, and this the detective was obliged to ferret out for himself, which he did by visiting or causing to be visited almost every Italian shop upon the East Side. Thus the incident of the shoes was brought to light. Strollo was at once taken to the morgue on reaching the city, and here for the first time his nerve failed him, for he could not bring himself to inspect the ghastly body of his victim. "Look!" cried Petrosini. "Is that the man?" "Yes, yes," answered the murderer, trembling like a leaf. "That is he." "You are not looking at him," said the detective. "Why don't you look at him? Look at the body." "I am looking at him," replied Strollo, averting his eyes. "That is he, my friend, Antonio Torsielli." The prisoner was now taken to police headquarters and searched. Here a letter was found in his hip pocket in his own handwriting, purporting to be from Antonio Torsielli to his brother Vito at Yonkers, but enclosed in an envelope addressed to Antonio at Lambertville. This envelope bore a red 2-cent stamp and was inscribed, "Antonio Torsielli, Box 470, Lambertville, New Jersey." The letter, as later translated in court by the interpreter, read as follows: Lambertville, July 30th, 1905. My dear brother, upon receipt of your news I feel very happy to feel you are well, and the same I can assure you from me. Dear brother, you cannot believe the joy I feel after such a long time to know where you are. I have been looking for you for 2 years, and never had any news from you. I could not, as you wrote to me to, come to you, because I had no money, and then I didn't know where to go, because I have always been in the country. Know that what little money I have I send it to mother, because if I don't help her nobody will, as you never write to her. I believe not to abandon her, because she is our mother, and we don't want her cursed. So then, if you like to see me, you come and take me. You spoke to me about work thither, but I don't understand about that work which you say, and then what will I do, because here I have work. Therefore, if you think I can come and work with you, let me know, because I have the address. But if you want to do better, you come and take me. Dear brother, I remind you about our mother, because I don't earn enough money, which she is your mother also. Dear brother, I hope you did not forget our mother. Dear brother, let me know the names of your children, and I kiss them. Many regards to your wife and aunt. I beg you to write to me. Dear regards, your brother Antonio Torsielli. When you answer, send the answer to the address below, Antonio Strollo. Strollo made no attempt to explain the possession of this letter, which, if sent at all, would naturally have come into the possession of the addressee. "And what was Vito's address at Yonkers?" inquired Petrosini. 1570 Yonkers, answered Strollo. "Is that the street number of a house, or a post office number?" asked the detective. "Neither," said Strollo, "just 1570 Yonkers." Thus the infamy of this villain was made manifest. He had invented out of his own brain the existence of Vito Torsielli in Yonkers, and had himself written the letters to Antonio which purported to come from him. He had used the simple fellow's love for his long-lost brother as the means to lure him to his destruction, and brutally murdered him for the sake of the few dollars which his innocent victim had worked so hard to earn to reunite him to his mother and his betrothed. The wounds in Strollo's hand and knee were found to correspond in shape and character with the 36 wounds in Torsielli's body, and the mushroom digger unhesitatingly identified him as the man in the company of the deceased upon the afternoon of the murder. It almost seemed like the finger of Providence indicating the assassin, when the last necessary piece of evidence in this extraordinary case was discovered. Petrosini had hurried to Lambertville immediately upon the discovery of the letter, and visited the post office. A young lady named Miss Olive Phillips had been employed there as a clerk for 12 years, and had lately had charge of what are known as the call boxes, that is to say, of boxes to which no keys were issued, but for the contents of which the lessees have to ask at the delivery window. These are very inexpensive, and in use generally by the Italian population of Lambertville, who are accustomed to rent them in common, one box to 3 or 4 families. She had noticed Strollo when he had come for his mail, on account of his flashy dress and debonair demeanor. Strollo's box, she said, was number 420. Petrosini showed her the envelope of the letter found in Strollo's pocket. The stamp indicated that it had been cancelled at Lambertville on July 26th. When she saw the envelope, she called Petrosini's attention to the fact that the stamp was a 2-cent red stamp, and said to his surprise that she was able to identify the letter on that account as one mailed by Strollo on July 26th. As there is no local delivery in the town, she explained, drop letters, or letters mailed by residents to other residents, may be franked for 1 cent. Now, in the first place, no Italian in Lambertville, except Strollo, so far as Miss Phillips could remember, had ever mailed a letter to another Italian in the same town. A frugal Italian, moreover, if he had done so, would have put on only the required amount of postage. On the 26th of July, Strollo had come to the post office and pushed this identical letter through the window, at the same time handing her 2 cents and asking her to put on a red stamp for him. She had been surprised at this, and had first thought of calling his attention to the fact that only a 1-cent stamp was necessary, but she had refrained, and put on the stamp. At the same time she had noticed that it was addressed to Antonio Torsielli, Lambertville, New Jersey. Strollo had then taken the letter and slipped it into the drop, and she had cancelled the stamp, taking the opportunity to examine the letter a second time. A stranger coincidence could hardly be imagined, and this observing young lady from the country was thus able to supply the most important link in the chain against the murderer, and to demonstrate conclusively that the wretch had himself been mailing in Lambertville the letters purporting to come from the fictitious brother in Yonkers. Strollo was now placed in the house of detention as a witness, a course frequently pursued when it is desirable to prevent a suspect from knowing that he is accused. The case against him was practically complete, for it did not seem humanly possible that any jury would hesitate to convict him upon the evidence, but juries are loath to find anyone guilty of murder in the first degree upon purely circumstantial evidence, and this was the first purely circumstantial case in a long time. Inspector Price, therefore, conceived the idea of trapping Strollo into a confession by placing a detective in confinement with him under the guise of being a fellow prisoner. It was, of course, patent that Strollo was but a child mentally, but he was shrewd and sly, and if he denied his guilt there was still a chance of his escape. Accordingly, a detective named Repetto was assigned to the disagreeable task of taking the part of an accused criminal. He was detailed to the house of detention, and remained there for 5 days, from September 8th to September 13th. Here Repetto became acquainted with Strollo and the other prisoners, giving his name as Silvio del Sordo, and his address as 272 Bowery. He played cards with them, read the papers aloud, and made himself generally agreeable. During this period he frequently saw the defendant write, and familiarized himself with his chirography. The scheme worked, and Repetto afterward received 5 letters from Strollo, sent after the latter had been removed from the house of detention to the Tombs and indicted for the murder of Torsielli. The first, dated September 22nd, was merely to inform his supposed friend Silvio of the change in his residence, and to inquire the whereabouts of another prisoner named Philip. The second would be pathetic, were it not written by the defendant in the case. It carries with it the flavor of the Calabrian hills. New York, October 17th, 1905. Sir Silvio. I write, and believe not to sicken you with my words, but it is enough that you are well in health. I take the liberty again, not having any one else but you, and I believe to find a brother in you, not a friend. I ask you nothing, only if you have time to come and see me as soon as possible. I ask you this as a favor because I know and believe to find a true friend, as I want to ask you a certain thing at the cost of my life. I will not say any more. Bring me 5 cents of paper and envelopes to write letters, and when you come I will give you the money. Nothing else. I am yours ever, servant and perfect friend, A. Strollo. The third letter from the perfect friend to his equally perfect friend is an extraordinary combination of ingenuity and ignorance. It contains the only suggestion of a defense, that of an alibi. New York, October 30th, 1905. Esteemed friend, with retard I answer in receiving yours. I was very, very glad. I believe all you told me, and I am grateful, and hope you will not betray me, because you know it will cost the life of a poor unfortunate. So do as you told me. Keep things to ourselves. If you wish to help me, you will do me a great service, and if God helps me, you can dispose of my life. So I will have you called unexpected, saying that I did not know if you remembered. So if you are called, the first thing you must do is make believe to look at me, and then you say you remember of having seen me looking at the pictures in front of place where you work, and you asked me if I wanted my pictures taken, and I said no. If they ask at what time, say 5:20 or 5:30 p.m., and that you spoke with me for quite a while. If they ask how was he dressed, the coat was black, the shoes russet, the trousers with white stripes, which is the one I am now wearing. What tie? I don't remember, I only know that he was well dressed. The hat was brown. If they ask, did he have a mark on his hand, say no, he had a ring with a black stone. How many times did you see him? Say that after your work you were going around Mott Street, and you saw me again, and how it was 8 o'clock or past 8, and you saw me with a handkerchief around my hand, and you said to me why I had my hand so. And he answered that someone struck him. I asked if it hurt much. He said he did not feel it. Did both of you go to drink? No. Where else did Strollo go? Strollo said he was going at the Bleecker Street Hotel to sleep. Did you see him again? No. Nothing else. If you want to help me, reflect well, but you don't need any more words from me. Say just what I have said, and I hope, with faith of a brother and not a friend, I am ever your friend, A. Strollo. It may, and probably will, appear to the reader, that a clearer case of guilt could hardly be established, but the action of juries is always problematical, and this was a case composed entirely of circumstantial evidence. The jury would be obliged to find that no reasonable hypothesis consistent with the innocence of the accused could be formulated upon the evidence. Thus, even in the face of the facts proven against him, some freak juryman might still have said, but after all, how do you know that Strollo killed him? Some other fellow might have done it. Even the faking of a defense does not prove the defendant guilty, but merely that he fears conviction, and is ready to resort to feigned testimony to secure his freedom. Many innocent men convict themselves in precisely this way. Accordingly, it was by no means with confidence that the people went to trial, but throughout this remarkable case it seemed as if it must have been preordained that Strollo should not escape punishment for his treacherous crime. No defense was possible, not even the partially prepared alibi was attempted, and the only thing that savored of a defense was the introduction of a letter alleged to have been received by the defendant while in the house of detention, and which, if genuine, would have apparently established that the crime had been perpetrated by the Black Hand. The offering of this letter was a curious and fatal blunder, for it was later proven by the people to be in Strollo's own handwriting. It was his last despairing effort to escape the consequences of his crime. Headed with a cross drawn in blood, it ran as follows: I swear upon this cross, which is the blood of my veins, Strollo is innocent. I swear upon the cross the revengeful Black Hand could save me. New York, October 12th, 1905. Sir Strollo, knowing you only by name, 8 days after that I leave, this letter will be sent to you. I leave at 7 o'clock with the steamer Britain the harbor. Therefore I leave betraying my oath that I have held for the last 3 years belonging to the Black Hand. I will leave 3 letters, one to you, one to the police officer Capri, and the other to the law, 300 Mulberry Street. All what I am saying I have sworn to before God. Therefore your innocence will be given you, first by God and then by the law, capturing the true murders. I am sure that they already captured the murderer of Torsielli. Who lured you to come to New York was Giuseppe Rosa, who knew you for nearly 2 years and who comes from Lambertville. Came among us and played you a trick. He is a Calabrese and has a mighty grudge. He and 4 others are averse to them. Announced the name of the man who stabbed you with the knife was Antonio Villa. He had to kill you, but you was fortunate. He is in jail for the present time, and I don't know for how long, but I know that he was arrested. Nothing else to say. I have done my duty in giving you all the information. 407 2nd Street, Jersey. It is clear from the letter that Strollo had formed a vague plan for his defense, which should, in part, consist of the claim that he, as well as Torsielli, had been marked for death by the Black Hand, and that while both had been induced to come to New York, the plans of the assassins had, in his case, miscarried. The reader has already observed that purely for the purpose of securing his continued interest in the present narrative, the writer has, as it were, told his story backward, reserving as long as possible the fact that the finding of the beloved Vito was a pure fiction invented by the murderer. At the trial, however, the jury listened breathlessly, while bit by bit the whole pathetic story was painted before them like a mosaic picture. They heard first the story of the mushroom digger, there of the expedition of Petrosini to Lambertville, of the identification of Torsielli's body, of the elaborate fabrications of Strollo, and in due course of the telltale letter in the murderer's pocket. Gradually the true character of the defendant's crime came over them, and they turned from him in aversion. The natural climax in the evidence was Miss Phillips's extraordinary identification of the defendant sitting at the bar as the man who had mailed upon the 26th of July at the Lambertville post office the envelope purporting to come from Yonkers and containing the forged letter from the imaginary Vito. Strollo remained almost to the last confident that he could never be convicted, but when his own letters in prison were introduced in evidence he turned ashen pale and stared fixedly at the judge. The jury deliberated but 15 minutes, their functions consisting of but a single ballot, followed by a prayer for the wretched murderer's soul. Then they filed slowly back, and in the waning light of the summer afternoon, just 1 year after the murder, and at the precise hour at which Strollo had killed his victim, pronounced him guilty of murder in the first degree. In due course his conviction was sustained by the Court of Appeals, and on March 11, 1908, he paid the penalty for his crime in the electric chair. End of Chapter 11. Recording by Colleen McMahon. End of True Stories of Crime from the District Attorney's Office by Arthur Cheney Train.